they aren't interested in doing that. But I mean, right now, it's whether it's.
I'll call this meeting of the Salem City Council for Monday, May 15th, 2023 to order. Tonight we have a work session. If you will, if the recorder will please call the roll.
Counselor Stapleton? I'm here. Counselor Nishioka? Here. Counselor Phillips?
Here.
Counselor Gwen? Counselor Gonzalez?
Here.
Counselor Hoy? Here. Counselor Nordyke?
Here.
Counselor Varney?
Here.
Mayor Hoy?
Here. If you join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Councilor Stapleton.
Well, we have no additions or deletions. Is that what we're talking about?
I'm sorry. No, we're on the approval of the special agenda.
I move approval of the special meeting agenda.
Second.
Moved by Stapleton, seconded by Phillips. Is there any discussion? Will the recorder please call the roll?
Counselor Nishioka? Here. Counselor Phillips?
Aye.
Counselor Gwen? Counselor Gonzalez?
Aye.
Counselor Hoy? Aye. Counselor Nordyke?
Aye.
Counselor Varney?
Aye.
Counselor Stapleton? Aye. Mayor Hoy?
Aye. Motion passes. And any additions or deletions to the agenda, Counselor?
Not tonight.
Thank you. So we are here tonight to discuss revenue options to sustain city services. And I am going to turn it over to Mayor Staley. Ooh, that's me. No. City Manager Staley.
Nice to meet you, Mayor Hoy. And good evening, members of council and community members. I am going to run through a one-slide PowerPoint presentation. If Kelly or Josh would bring that up, I would appreciate it. I have just a few brief comments that I would like to share this evening. We have been at this since January in some capacity after Josh delivered the revenue forecast or the budget forecast for our 24 budget process. We have started in on that process. Obviously, we've had 5 budget committee meetings at this point. So I have a few observations. And I guess I would start with, I am more convinced now than I was at the start that our budget problems are real. This isn't a fiction. This is a reality. We're spending approximately $11 million in general fund balance this year, 2024, in this proposed budget in order to balance the budget. That is not sustainable. So we will either be reducing our spending or increasing our revenues in the near future. Waiting is not an option. I'm sorry, but we need to make decisions, and we need to do them soon, because if we decide to move forward with revenue, we need to do that expeditiously. And if we decide to not do that, then we're going to have to plan for reductions. And the longer time we have to do that, the better we can do that. The more sensitively and effectively we can do that. These are very hard decisions, and I recognize what an incredibly hard spot you are in, being asked to consider increasing revenues or reducing services is the hardest decision a legislative body has to make. Your staff and the consultant team that you're going to hear from this evening are extraordinary. I have been in this governmental budgeting process for over 30 years. These are qualified, capable people who are giving you the information you need to make decisions. How you use that information is certainly up to you, but you have the information, and if you don't, I've seen the number of emails that Josh has responded to and the number of questions that he has answered. And yes, he is absolutely happy to continue to do that right and up until June 12th when we have our public hearing on the budget. None of this is easy to explain or absorb. We saw that with the Budget Committee. We spent over 10 hours talking about the budget, responding to questions, deliberating, and it wasn't really until the last meeting when you saw things kind of come together there, but it wasn't easy. There are no easy options. Regardless of what we do, there will be nobody standing at the finish line cheering us on. We will not get adulation regardless of what we do, which direction we go in. I have spent literally hours reviewing the budget at a cost center level, and we're going to be talking about that this evening. There's no shortcuts. There's no easy answers hidden in the back of the book. There are simply hard decisions to make. And the decisions that would have to be made are truly, truly difficult and would have a significant impact on the general fund and all services that are included in the general fund. A couple of free bonus items here. I hope that you can all trust this process. What you're doing and what you've done with the Budget Committee is what needs to be done. We've had the conversations, we've had the deliberations, the dialogue, you've asked the questions, you've got the feedback, the data that you need, and we're continuing to narrow things down and continuing to refine this thinking, but you are doing the right thing. You just have to trust the process, and the decision that you make, regardless of what that is the right decision for right now. And then last but not least, my favorite of all of my truisms, particularly for City Council, is to stay focused, be patient, and work together. And that's how councils and organizations and communities are successful. So with that, I believe I am turning it over to Colleen and her team for a discussion about reduction analysis.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Colleen Rosillas with Moss Adams for the record. So, where do I need to point this? I'm gonna have to stand at the podium anyway, I think. Oh, there we go. All right. So we have been before you 3 times before to talk about how we got here, how the city compares with other cities, what our potential options are, what the future looks like for the city. Tonight we're here to talk a little bit about that and just give a reminder to you all and the community, as well as to talk about what potential budget reductions could look like and how they will impact the community if sustainable revenue is not found over the next couple of months. So when we were here before, the first thing that we did was benchmarking of the city's internal service levels to other cities. We also validated the city's forecast model, the assumptions underneath it, made sure that the forecast was aligned with best practice so that we knew the numbers we were working with were real. We also looked at the revenue options that had been proposed by city staff, validated those assumptions, and looked at other peer cities in Oregon to see what situation they were in, which is similar to Salem's. We have a structural issue with local government finance in Oregon. So just a very quick summary. We compared the city to 8 full-service cities in the West. We looked at cities that had the broad range of services that Salem does have. We found from an internal service level, so I'm talking about the engine that drives the city, HR, IT, finance, legal, fleet, facilities. The city is significantly understaffed, even with the addition of some of the outsourcing that the city does. Ultimately, this city has not kept up to population growth, nor have we restored these services to the levels that they were at prior to the last recession. We validated the city's financial forecast. We did not find any calculation errors. We found that the forecast was aligned with industry best practice. We also stress tested the assumptions behind the financial forecast to make sure that those were strong so that when you are out in the community, you are able to answer questions and have confidence in those numbers. Was that a question or?
I don't know what that
Feedback?
was.
Okay, great. We're going to keep going. All right. We also conducted some benchmarking of other cities in Oregon. So folks talk about we have a structural issue with the way that we fund local government in Oregon. We wanted to pull out some specific numbers so that you can understand the magnitude of the problem and also compared to yours. So when we look across this table, we see that many cities have multi-million-dollar deficits, and that they have either implemented or are considering similar revenue measures. So for example, Eugene has about a $20 million deficit. They have implemented a payroll tax. They are looking at local option levies that are to be renewed, and then they still have $8 million left over of what they call to be identified. That's probably your closest comparator among these cities, but it is worth looking at what are our options and what are potentially on the table and what's on the table in other cities as well.
Question, Bob?
Yeah.
Can you define what a local option levy is?
Sure. So a local option levy is a local property tax, and it must go to the voters for approval, and it has to be done every 5 years to be renewed. Local option levies can fund specific services. They can support special purpose districts, the county government, school district, transit, lots of different types of local government. They can also support the general fund. Josh, is there anything you would add?
Josh Eggleston, Chief Financial Officer. Just that the limitation with compression, and just that in the Marion County side of Salem, we're already over the $10 limit. So there are properties that are currently being compressed, and a local option levy is compressed first before it touches all the other districts.
All right, so we're here tonight to talk about the evaluation that we did of potential budget reductions. So we focused on the effects to the community. This was not a FTE reduction analysis. It was a reduction analysis looking at programs and services provided to the residents and to the business community in Salem. We're detailing those to you tonight, and we really wanted to focus on that programmatic level. I'm going to hand this over to Tommy to go through our analysis.
Hi everyone, I'm Tommy Conkling. I'm an analyst at Moss Adams, and I'm going to be showing you the weeds of what we did. So we started with the city's priority-based budget framework, which is a framework made by the city that evaluates the importance in spending on functions rather than departments so that we can look at the budget in a more detailed level. We used this to come up with an initial set of potential reductions. We then met with department heads to make sure our ideas aligned with city expertise. And then we refined our ideas and framework based on the expertise of city department heads. We then detailed the community impacts of what these potential reductions could be. I want to emphasize that there's a multitude of ways to potentially address reductions. So we analyzed a few scenarios of what would be likely to occur based on the city's established priorities. Although there's many ways to cut specific services, generally based on the city's priorities, you're going to make reductions to some functions over others because the deficit is so large. So we used a principle framework to prioritize and detail potential reductions, and some of these principles are as follows. First, internal services, like Colleen was saying, at the city are pretty understaffed, both in terms of internal functioning and when compared to peers. Second, police and fire are already understaffed, and they are really aligned to the city's priorities. Third, service reductions would have to be imminent. Like Josh said, like Keith said, the time to act is now. And that reductions would be strategic, so it's not going to be X% across the board. It's going to be based on where it most aligns with the city's priorities and what the city has to provide. Fourth, we also considered cost recovery capacity of functions. So if functions are able to recover some of their costs through fees or other methods, it affected how they were prioritized in the potential reductions. And then finally, functions are interconnected. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to reduce one function separately. It has to come with others. So using the city's priority-based budget, you can locate city services on the axes that are to the right of you on the screen. The x-axis here is the level of mandate for the city to provide, and your y-axis here is the alignment with the city's strategic plan. And the information here on these two axes were made by the city already. This is not something that we made up. It was something that we were using from the city. So we broke this conceptualization up into groups. At the bottom left corner, you have the functions that are the least mandated for the city to provide and are the least aligned to the city's strategic plan. At the upper right-hand corner, you have the most mandated and the most aligned programs. And then even off the chart here, at the most right, most upper position, you have public safety. It's mandated for the city to provide, and it's really aligned to the city's strategic plan. So in considering what would be prioritized in reductions, we first looked at the first column at the very bottom, least mandated, least aligned, and then we gradually move up for that's slightly more aligned, and then move to what's a little more mandated but least aligned to the city's strategic plans, so that there's some prioritization of what should be reduced or cut first. I want to emphasize that these groupings are a tool to establish priorities, and they're not absolute judgments of what should be reduced. It helps us to have a potential glimpse into the future based on the city's priorities about what your city and community would look like if these reductions were to occur. So for example, group 1 here has the least mandated, least aligned programs, and we have the following functions. In recreation, we have some youth sports and special outreach. In IT, we have some, but not all, because you can't get rid of it entirely, but service desk support. In finance, there's some room to reduce analytics support and special projects, although that comes with some financial risk. With fire and non-essential services, you have some school and youth outreach programs. You also have a few library functions, and a few Center 50 Plus programs. So based on this exercise, regardless of scenario, there's some key headline takeaways that I want to emphasize here. Pardon me. So we begin at this 19.4 million deficit target, and then based on our, as I was saying, we eliminated or reduce. Not eliminate, we modeled the elimination or reduction of various functions, starting at less mandated, less aligned, gradually moving to more mandated, more aligned, until that 19.4 million deficit is closed and the budget is balanced. So some really headline takeaways here. In all likelihood, the homelessness efforts funded by the general fund will probably likely be eliminated. And in any scenario, you're making severe cuts or eliminations to core community services, including recreation, library, and parks. In most scenarios, internal services are stretched unsustainably thin with limited abilities to support efficiency, and internal services are already pretty understaffed. And probably most important to hear, it's going to be extremely hard to get to that 19.4 million figure if there's no additional revenues without touching fire and police core services in some way, even if it's a relatively small reduction compared to other services. And then finally, if revenue or expense projections shift, for example, if in 2.5 weeks we default on our sovereign debt as a country, you're going to see more cuts need to occur. Translating this into a couple further takeaways on the community. People experiencing homelessness are further underserved. The community services that promote quality of life and equity are cut, reduced, or provided at a lower level of quality than we're used to. Internal services slow, stop, and sometimes might break down. This will affect recruitment and retention, not only because the HR function is reduced, but because it makes Salem a worse place to work. Public safety services are further reduced, negatively affecting many aspects of public life. And finally, it's important to note that cuts to community services, homelessness services, and internal services are not fully disconnected from public safety. Although police and fire are the core of public safety services, community services in particular have effects on public safety, particularly in the long term. Public space, public services, and public goods have deep effects on people within a community. Summing this all up, if no new revenues are adopted, the ensuing reductions require some forms of core service cuts. Regardless of the precise programs that are cut or reduced, the Salem community would be greatly affected. The deficit is large, and closing it will be significant. I want to pause here. We have 2 scenarios that we can run through with some more detailed numbers, but want to pause here for comments, questions, concerns that anyone wants to bring up.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Councilor Nordyke.
Thank you so much for the analysis. 2 questions. First of all, I'm looking at the report that was attached to our agenda, and you talk about benchmarking results, staffing, and you have charts that show whether our staffing is below, at, or greater than staffing levels for peer cities. For example, city manager, budget, human resources, IT, legal, and so on. Did you also do this analysis for our police and fire so that we could compare our staffing levels here to police and fire departments with other peer cities?
So we did not. We were asked to look only at internal service benchmarking because the external level of service analysis was already completed by city staff and is based, for example, with police and fire on things like response times and call volumes, and so the level of service is different. So that was not within our scope of work.
Okay, thank you. And then going back to your slide 11, reduction framework, it identified who was in group 1, but I don't see, unless I'm missing it, the slides which identify what makes up groups 4, 5, 9, 11, and so on. Is that somewhere in my materials?
That's not present in the materials. It can be provided if you want. It would be exhaustive to present 120 different functions on the slide, but yeah.
Can you tell me, group 14 has both the most mandated and most aligned to the city strategic plan according to your slides? Can you tell me generally who's in group 14?
If you give me a moment, I can pull that up.
Great, thank you.
Other questions? Okay. Where are we headed next?
Councilor Nordyke, I can get to your request either at the end here or in a moment, but I can move on to more detailed scenarios now.
Great.
I have a question.
Yep.
Yeah, Councilor Gonzalez, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mayor. A question, I know we've been referring to this every once in a while as the financial cliff. And this could be anybody could answer, but when was this cliff first seen? When was it first visible by?
I think that's for me. So really good question. I'd say it's evolved over time and been addressed multiple times. If you remember back to 2008 through 2013, there were pretty drastic reductions. I mean, there was certainly a financial cliff then. But the nature of the general fund, when you're in a constrained fiscal environment, and you're always spending to that edge, and then your costs continue to increase at a faster rate than your revenues, you're always going to see that cliff until you're able to get a more diverse, more sustainable revenue stream, and then don't add until you can actually afford to add services.
Other questions?
I was actually asking about this cliff, because I was on the budget committee 8 years ago, so I remember. But this specific one that we're having to address today.
So I guess to address that question, so we saw a cliff several years ago when we were looking at the city operations fee increase and the payroll tax increase. The payroll tax was pulled from the ballot at that point. We received a couple different federal dollars. So those federal dollars are now depleted, and we're seeing that fiscal cliff, that deficit return, now that we're not seeing those one-time revenues in the general fund.
Mr. Staley, I think, wants to respond as well.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Josh covered it. I think the most current iteration of the cliff was identified in 2018, and then in 19 you had the conversations about revenue options and with the intention of putting something on the ballot, and ultimately that was withdrawn, but the cliff didn't go away. It simply was moved further away as a result of the infusion of federal dollars in 20 and 21.
Other questions? Councilor Nordyke.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I recall the last time we met over in the library conference space, when we were looking at the deficits in staffing and funding for the city manager's office. That was before the city manager's office had hired a second deputy city manager. Did you take into account that new hiring for this data in front of us tonight?
We haven't updated that analysis with the current budget year. We certainly can update it with the current budget year. Even with the addition of a deputy city manager, the city manager's office has pretty significantly less FTE than most other peers.
We now have 2 deputy city managers, so even with 2,
Yeah.
we're still grossly understaffed, you're saying?
2 deputy city managers gets you pretty equal to other cities of your size. Many cities of your size have 3. There's also typically analysts, more than one part of a communication staff, for example, so there's typically quite a bit more in the office.
And another question, if I may. We are a council of volunteers, so I don't have an assistant. Councilor Varney doesn't have an assistant. The mayor has an assistant. I'm curious, just generally speaking, cities of our size, what kind of staff is there dedicated staffing support for the members of council other than the mayor?
That's a great question. So not usually. What we see is cities typically somewhere around 400,000 to 500,000 and up. They start paying their council members as if you might be more of a half-time or closer to a full-time job, and then there might be more staff assigned. Often what we will see in a city of your size is maybe one executive assistant or operational person to help manage calendars, get people where they need to go, that sort of thing, get you the information that you need. In larger cities, often council members have analysts that they either share or help, or sometimes bigger cities have more than one, so that helps you to make policy. And Tommy, do you have an answer to her previous question?
Yes, I'd like to emphasize, you asked about that upper right-hand corner, the most mandated, most aligned. Even more so, that's more mandated and more aligned than that, as I was saying, would be that core public safety. We're talking core police, core fire. But just short of that, 3 functions within there are city council support, some data analysis and reporting on required reports that the city has to put out, and then also long-range planning are three of those functions that the city must perform, and that is aligned to your strategic plan.
And just to confirm, that chart was strictly about general fund, is that correct? So it wouldn't include things like water, sewer, that sort of thing,
Correct.
right?
This is just general fund.
Great. Thank you. Other questions? Councilor Stapleton.
Clarifying point, the two city deputy managers that we have are not new positions. They are reallocations of other positions that you have utilized, moving folks from different areas with realignment. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is definitely correct.
Okay.
Counselor.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure that the public knew that at a time like this, we are not going out and hiring more people in different management positions, but we are actually working very hard to realign the staff that we do have to make sure that we are high functioning and utilizing their dollars the best that we can.
Well said. Thank you.
Councilor Phillips.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, and thank you for being here. This conversation just jarred some memories that I kind of want to get to with a comment/question. It's been my experience over the past several years, both when seeking this position, now serving for the last 2.5 years, that it feels like our staff are pulling double and sometimes triple duty because we're consolidating and realigning and trying to maximize efficiency. Is there any way to compare that, complexity or that aspect of it to our peer cities? Like, is it normal for people to have 3 titles?
So short answer is no. It's very common in a city that is resource constrained for people to pick up pieces of other people's jobs when they leave. You have extraordinarily dedicated and talented public servants who are here to serve the public and, not for fame and fortune. So we do see a lot of folks wearing a lot of hats around the city. We conducted, when we were first engaged with you all, an organizational assessment citywide, and we identified quite a few positions where folks were in multiple roles or had a significant amount of knowledge that no one else had because there was not the ability to have backup. The city has done some succession planning, but it's hard to do succession planning when you can't see what the future holds as well. All of the evidence would be anecdotal because we would need to ask another city to also maybe do a time study or self-report, but it is something that you could maybe find out through interviews with other city managers, for example.
Any other questions? Okay. Oh, Councilor Nishioka.
Thank you, Mayor Hoy. This is not so much a question, but just a clarifying point. In a couple of my neighborhood associations, they also had inquired about 2 deputy city managers and the income, that what kind of changes, what cost that was having for the city. And so I asked the same questions. And not only did I find out that it was sort of regrouping, it wasn't adding a new person, it was just retitling. And in that retitling, there would be a minor increase in their salary, but it was fairly minor. It really did not add any significant changes. And so explaining that to the neighborhood associations, they understood and appreciated the fact that there was more of a succession in place and more deputy city managers overseeing departments. So it really did feel like a better reconstruction. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Any other questions or comments? I think we're ready to move on.
Great. I'm going to run through 2 financial scenarios. They present 2 extremes with regard to public safety. As I was discussing, there's many potential ways that you could solve this. However, there are very similar things throughout because, regardless of scenario, because the deficit is so large. So this first scenario, we really prioritized public safety. And so the goal here was what would we have to do to reduce as little as possible to core police, core fire services? So I was explaining previously, right off the bat at the top, homelessness services, those that are financed by the general fund, would be cut. Internal services, that 1.7 million figure is really based on our discussions with city department heads and our experience with other cities, really the maximum that we would recommend reducing before things really start to break down to the extent that's really detrimental. Your internal services are already really understaffed. I'm going to skip ahead to police and fire, and then I'm going to come back to community services. This scenario, even after the significant community service reductions, still has about 1.9 million, and so that's currently split between fire and police. That decision was relatively arbitrary. We'll get into more detail in the next scenario, where showing what a 10% reduction would look like. I do want to highlight here in both of these cases, even with this, it's hard to call it minor, but relatively minor, $900,000 reduction. You have your emergency response reduced. Your police staffing, there are no industry numbers on precisely the staffing level, but your 2021 independent assessment of the Salem Police Department noted understaffing, particularly to pursue the community policing goals. Fire does have some industry standards, understaffed by approximately 100 positions, and that's before any reductions would take place. Moving back to community services, this figure is very large. This is where the bulk of reductions would come from in this scenario, and regardless of scenario, it's likely where the bulk of your reductions would come from. In this scenario, all of these are true. The Center 50 Plus would be closed. Community recreation would be eliminated or greatly reduced. Library hours would be cut significantly based on the investments that you guys recently made into your library. We just took it upon ourselves to say getting rid of the library is off the table. It is an option that you could do, but in this scenario, the hours would be cut significantly. Parks maintenance is slashed. Permitting and planning is further slowed. That can really have economic development and effects to the tax base. The city equity, climate, and tree maintenance goals that I know are priorities for this body are negatively affected. Public engagement and outreach effects are reduced. Social services grants are cut significantly, although not eliminated. And then the urban development efforts are negatively impacted. Sort of summing up the scenario one, I would need to highlight once again that city services are interconnected. Even when we prioritize public safety, when we reduce or eliminate homelessness, community, and internal services, it does have negative effects on public safety. I think a great example of this are the internal services with regard to technology and human resources that affect our ability to, your ability rather, to staff police. Also to note, the large cuts to internal services that are presented in this scenario will work for a few years. Eventually, particularly with technology, there's only so much underinvestment that you can do before systems really start to break down. Now, scenario two here presents sort of the complete opposite with regard to the reductions to public safety. This is saying, what if we took 10%, approximately 10% police and fire to retain some community services? Once again, this assumes eliminating the general fund homelessness services. Internal services in this scenario would be unaffected, but I should note are still below peers and best practice levels. Moving ahead, and then I'll come back to community services. The effect on police would be pretty severe. You have somewhere in the neighborhood of approximately 40 FTE would be eliminated, and drastically fewer investigations for anything other than violent crimes, which includes property crimes. Moving on to fire, this would be about 2 fire stations, which is about 18 FTE. And based on fire best practices and the software available to them, the department estimates that would result in an additional about 1,000 emergencies outside of that 5.5 minute, 5.5 minute response time standard. Moving back to community services, the difference here with internal services and the core public safety services retains you about, was that 7.7 million? So these are scenarios within scenarios. So these present three options out of the many that would exist about, with that savings, what community services could be retained at the levels that exist now. So one option would be library unaffected, Center 50 Plus unaffected, parks maintenance unaffected. Or you could retain Center 50 Plus, parks maintenance, recreation and youth development, and the community events and partnerships, or library and parks maintenance, urban development efforts, permitting, and your climate action plan. Finally, once again, I keep saying this, but city services are interconnected, as you well know. Even if you do make these cuts to public safety, it will negatively impact the public experience of the community services that you do retain. And that's it for this presentation. Are there any further questions, concern, comments about these two potential scenarios?
Questions on the scenarios to better understand what they're outlining? Mr. City Manager.
I guess there's just one other thing I would like to add is that even though, this gets us to the $19.4 million reduction, the following year we would be having a similar, although smaller, conversation about what's next, because we have a structural imbalance with no additional revenues to begin to close that gap. So we would be back probably talking about a reduction in the terms of 5 million as opposed to 19 million. But I just want that on the table also.
Councilor Phillips.
I think two questions. First, what is in the both scenarios? There's the homeless services, the 2 million. What does that include? And the follow-up question is, what does it not include? I don't think it includes a lot of the one-time funded things, but can you help me understand what this is and isn't?
Yeah, I can take that one. So there's $2 million of general fund services, ATRAP, the SOS team, a few other things built into that $2 million. In addition to what you see here in the general fund, there wouldn't be funds to sustain the micro-villages or the navigation center past the dates that we've specified, July or June 2024 and June 2025 for each of those. So those are outside of this picture.
So no matter what scenario we were to go with, those things are all eliminated.
That is correct in these two scenarios. Yes.
Yeah.
And can you remind me or us what are those services like per year? What's the cost for like the navigation center, managed micro shelter sites, and the things that aren't in the general fund?
Sure. So all total, it's about 9.6 million. 9.6 million.
So would it be inappropriate to say that if we wanted to maintain the services we currently have, that we need to find $19.4 million for the general fund and $9.6 million for the homeless services if we want to maintain those things that we already have?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Other questions? We ready to move on? Such an uplifting conversation. All right, who's next?
John is next.
Hit the green button.
I think it's me. John Horvick, Senior Vice President at DHM Research. We recently conducted 2 focus groups on behalf of the City of Salem to talk about employee-paid payroll tax. And you all have a report that we provided to the city in your handout. So I'm not going to show any slides, but I'm just going to try to talk through at least what I see as the big findings, and then try to answer any questions you might have. So just to ground
John, could you pull that microphone more square in front of your face?
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Just to ground ourselves in what we did. So 2 focus groups. So these are focus groups. These are in-depth conversations with, in this case, 19 people. So 9 in one group, 9 in the other. And when I'm doing focus groups, I like to say to my participants, and I'll say it to you as well, surveys are really good at asking people what they think. You know, do you support something? Do you oppose it? Do you like something? Do you dislike it? That's where their strength is. And focus groups, their strength is really in more the why questions. What are your values, experiences, beliefs to help you form your opinions about the what? Now, they're instructive. They give us guidance. But what I would hesitate to say is that you can project out, generalize these two focus groups to what the whole community thinks. But I think these give us a very good sense of both the range of perspectives and the intensity that people feel towards the issues we talked about, as well as good guidance on the sorts of questions, concerns, hopes that they have as well. Okay, so if there is future research or community outreach, that's going to help clarify some answers for us today. So I do want to set the stage what we can say about these groups and what we can't. So 18 participants, 2 groups. These are 2-hour groups. So, community members came but didn't know what the heck they were going to talk about. And were willing to have a conversation with their neighbors about community issues for a couple hours. Now, their time is valuable, and we pay them for that time and their expertise, so they are compensated for being there. So the $100 per person for the 2 hours that they gave us, and these were just conducted about 2 weeks ago on April 29th. So, brand new, fresh perspectives from the community. We recruited people from a list of registered voters. So we get the list of registered voters directly from the Secretary of State. Because this might be something that goes to the voters, at least potentially, and when we were putting together this group, we were thinking November 2023 is that potential election date. We really wanted to focus on what we call likely voters. And there's different ways to define what a likely voter is, but in this case, we recruited and then talked to people who had voted in at least 2 of the last 4 elections. So either 2 of the last 4 general elections or primary elections. So these are people who are pretty consistent voters, the type of people who we think would show up in an election in November. Okay. Now, we begin focus groups like this. Again, they don't know why they're there. That is, they don't know the topic. And then we begin by talking about the community. And we do that through some standard questions like, are things heading in the right direction? Are they off on the wrong track? And then we ask just, what are the most important issues that you're experiencing in Salem? What do you want your community leaders to do something about? We ask that in part to get a sense of how people are feeling and get them talking to each other about community issues. And we've heard the sorts of things that I've come and talked to you before about, which is most people in Salem think that the city's off on the wrong track, and their biggest concerns are homelessness, cost of living really driven by affordability of housing, concerns about crime. There are other things, of course, that people have concerns about, but if you sort of think like, what are the big ones? It's homelessness above and beyond everything else. Affordability, cost of living. Those are the big things that are driving perceptions. Now, feeling negative about the community is not unique to Salem at all, nor is homelessness being the top issue unique to Salem at all. If I look back at work that we've done, surveys that we've done in communities across Oregon over the last at least 3 years, but probably maybe even going back to 5, every community save one, when we've asked the question, what's the biggest issue facing your community? It's been homelessness. Okay, so this is not a Salem unique to Salem, but it is the thing that they care about in their community more than anything else. That's important as we talked about the potential tax, because how they think about it and what it might fund affects how they think of their support. Okay. So wrong direction or wrong track, but when we ask, are you satisfied with the services that are being delivered to you from the city? Now, not that many people said very satisfied when we gave them that choice, but most people say that they're at least satisfied. Overwhelmingly say that they're at least satisfied. So there is like a perception of, hey, what I feel like I'm getting from the city, I value, it's working for me, I'm satisfied. But not everything in Salem is going well, and we have these real challenges with cost of living, homelessness, etc. Now, some of the cost of living stuff, a lot of the cost of living attitudes are not pointed their finger at the city. I mean, they recognize that there's been inflation that's affected the country nationally. They recognize interest rates have risen. So those aren't Salem unique things. And so know that too. We did then ask, well, do you think that the city has the resources it needs to deliver the services that you value? And we actually asked this twice. So we asked it first kind of cold, and then we had some conversation. They heard each other's perspectives, and we asked a similar question again. When we started the first time, most people thought, maybe not real sure. It's not a ton of, the average person doesn't know a ton about how cities are budgeted and, how finances work, but sort of a sense that costs have been rising. My pocketbook is not as full as it used to be, and the city's probably affected by that too. Very perceptible to other opinions though. And so when we had some conversation, had people think about as well as who's paying their quote unquote fair share of taxes, or maybe who's overburdened and who's not. Attitude shifted towards more confidence that the city in fact does have the resources it needs, and maybe they're not spending the dollars wisely. I think if we had more conversations, we get more nuance on that, but that's the way that the conversation went. And it's typically those conversations about skepticism of government are big and broad. That government, kind of quote unquote, or capital G government, they just don't spend their money wisely. They're not efficient. They could cut the fat. Have they looked at all the different things that they could do to be more cost effective? It's really not often driven by specific concerns that they can describe. In fact, I pushed them on that. Can you, when they said to me, they could be doing better, they must be wasting money someplace. And then I ask, well, can you give me the specific example? And that's really difficult for folks to come up with. But the attitude's there, and they can be moved in that direction pretty quickly. So that's sort of the context at which we had this conversation. They're thinking about the issues, how they're perceiving the community, and then we asked them about potential employee paid payroll tax. Now, in that, we also asked, where does the city get most of its revenue? And are different groups of people paying too much, too little about the right amount in taxes? Now, I've done a lot of focus groups. I've done a lot of focus groups about public financing. And usually people give me all sorts of don't knows, not sures, or wrong answers when I ask about how cities are funded. In this case, nearly everybody was able to say property taxes are a key source of funding for city revenue. So they're starting from a pretty good spot relative to other conversations I've had. And of course, if we push them about, how do property taxes work, et cetera, I think, like most places, that they would struggle. Oregon's made it complicated to understand, so that's understandable. But they do think that homeowners of the different groups we asked about are paying too much. And a lot of that's tied to, just general concerns about property taxes, but also when they're thinking about the challenges in Salem, housing affordability is a big one. And so that influences how they think about property taxes. Okay. We also asked, are people who work in Salem but don't live in Salem paying their fair share? Now, there the answers are pretty ambivalent. Some say, yeah, they're probably not, but a lot of people saying that they don't know. Now, that's a question we asked them, and that's a question that could be put to them. But I wouldn't say it's a question that many of them have asked themselves before. So take that as their first impressions rather than certainty about how they feel. They could be given information about all sorts of different things about how this might impact them, the community, city services, and their attitudes might shift. But this time I'm a spot maybe they're not real sure, haven't thought a lot about it before. Now, once we got to the specifics, we asked about 3 different rates of an employee payroll tax that could be. And the top rate's 0.66. I'm actually forgetting what the two, at the top of my head, what the 2 other rates are. But the gist of the 2 other rates, or the 3 rates, were: one is a rate that would raise some revenue, but not be enough to avoid cuts. A rate that would raise enough revenue to maintain city services at their current levels. And a third rate which would allow to maintain at current levels and address some additional needs, specifically homelessness. Now, presented this, and then we said, first of all, is an employee paid payroll tax a good way to fund city services or a bad way? But 2 to 3 said it's a bad way to fund city services. Now, again, don't assume that means 2 to 3 in the community or 2 to 3 voters would vote against something. But they do assume that voters are going to start with some skepticism. They're going to need to understand why we're doing this, what it's going to fund, how it's going to improve my life, and what are potential downsides as well. Of the rates that we asked about, a plurality preferred the 0.66. So the rate which would fund city services and some revenue to address homelessness. Now that's a plurality. A majority chose some other rate. right? So either the lowest rate or the middle rate. And so, it's a bit of interpretation, your choice, and how you want to interpret those results. But that's where we landed. In terms of reasons that people might support and pay employee payroll tax and why they might oppose, the reasons that we heard most for support was, me, the moderator, and the information we gave them described that the city's got a financial challenge and they value services and they want to maintain them, so there's a need to be met, so big picture need. I'd say the main one, though, is that their driving concern, the thing that they most want to address, the thing that they're most anxious about, is addressing homelessness. And so, that ability to meet that need, that concern, is motivating for some. And then, the third is this idea of it's a principle fairness. And again, it's one I don't think that people had thought a lot about before we sat them down. But when they thought about it, the sense that, hey, Salem in particular brings in a lot of people that use our roads, rely on our police and fire. Maybe they should contribute something to that. So that exists in there. But they have to think about it. It's not necessarily something that I think comes out at first. Now, concerns. A big one is just the general, no more taxes. We're burdened too much. We shouldn't pay any more taxes. No. The other is, as I've mentioned, cost of living. And that is probably the biggest concern, is just that, gosh, I'm squeezed. I can't afford it anymore. But that actually does cut two ways, because they do see cost of living affecting them. It must affect the city too. And so, people do see both sides of that. This was resonant with some participants, but I wouldn't say the majority, but those who it did matter to mattered a lot, which is that it could be a disincentive for business to locate and stay in Salem, and that could make the financial situation more challenging for the city. And then the other one was, those who particularly came in with some doubt that the city was doing everything it can already to address its budget challenges, thought that, no, we shouldn't do this because this will force city leaders to really take a hard look at the budget and make the adjustments that are needed. Then lastly, I'll say we talked to people about if a tax like this were implemented, what is a better way to do it? Have it affect every wage earner, kind of $1, or some sort of exemptions for low wage earners. And by and large, 2 out of 3 said that there should be some sort of exemption. They're very concerned about cost of living. They're sensitive to challenges, particularly that low-income individuals and families have, and that's where they landed. Now, we didn't have a long conversation about the challenges of perhaps implementing that and maybe what the trade-offs are. But as a matter of values, it was really clear where they started. And with that, I'll pause, answer any questions you might have.
Questions? Councilor Gwynn.
Can you tell us anything about the demographics of the focus group participants?
I don't have them in front of me right now. They are in the materials that we provided. We aim to try to match the demographics of likely voters in the city. And I would have to look them up, but they're in the materials that are provided.
Other questions?
They're not in the PowerPoint deck, I should say. They're in a separate document, but again, that's been provided to the city. Yeah.
Well, and I was asking also for our people that might be watching.
Oh, sure. I would have to look. I mean, the one thing I'd say is I just happened to be looking at them this morning. I don't want to make this a partisan issue, but the participants lean a little more Democratic than the city is, and to the extent that this is a tax concept, take that into account. And that wasn't our goal, but just in terms of, who was able to be recruited and who showed up that day, that leaned a little bit more Democratic. And that probably the one that I might call out just for thinking about attitudes about tax policy.
Well, and I was thinking to age, do you know if they were homeowners, business owners? Were there any?
Didn't ask about business owners. We asked age. The plurality were in that 35 to 55 year age category. I can't recall if we asked about home ownership or not, but if you sort of think about the profile of a likely voter in a special election in an odd numbered year, your median, the age of your median voter is probably going to be 60, 65, something like that. And, I don't know the exact numbers would be in Salem, but I would assume something between 70 and 80% of those are going to be homeowners. Also, we're talking about payroll tax, so Josh probably know, but the about 60% of adults are in the labor force. If we're talking about an older electorate, you're going to have a relatively small number of people who are paying a payroll and payroll tax compared to, say, a general election in a presidential year.
So what I think I'm hearing you say, John, and please correct me if I'm misinterpreting that, but you're saying that of the people who are likely to vote, most of them aren't going to be impacted by the tax?
I'm hesitant to say most, because I just have to run the numbers. A relatively large percent are not going to be subject to the payroll tax themselves. Just affected is also sort of judgment, how things affect a community. But yes, they're probably not earning a wage at which they would see it come out of their paychecks.
Thank you. Councillor Stapleton.
Thank you. So I'm trying to kind of take everything you've said and kind of put it in a neat little package for myself. What I'm hearing you say is that there is a lot of history, not tons, but a lot of history to explain to voters. Mm-hmm. There is the idea of a new type of tax, like a payroll tax, that would be hard to explain maybe to some, and the why, of course. And then also you're saying that the feedback that we're getting from our community members is really the same that we've been getting for the last several years, which is emergency services and services for our unsheltered are the most important things for people. Is that everything?
Oh, those are big ones. You are asking voters to potentially support, either directly or through a vote or indirectly through the representatives, to support a tax that potentially could address one of their most important concerns, homelessness, maybe causes them anxiety about just the cost of living in the city. And it's a mechanism that at this point they're unfamiliar with. That's a puzzle that needs to be solved somehow, or addressed somehow. And these results, I think, kind of paint a picture of how voters are thinking about it, and I think help us be realistic that this is not. I've done a lot of focus groups where you kind of walk out and think, man, that's a slam dunk. And that's not the way I felt after these.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Phillips.
Yeah, thank you. Trevor Phillips, Ward 3, for those listening at home. I guess I just want to follow up on that last conversation and ask you the questions that I heard you say you probably can't answer. But how big of a lift would this be, based on any anecdotal or experience you've had, if we were to take this to the voters in November in some way, shape, or form? Is this a moderately big lift, an easy lift, or a huge lift?
I hesitate to qualify it. Projecting out from a couple focus groups is really a struggle.
Fair.
So, I'm hesitant, but I'm trying to find my words here. You should assume that in order to get this passed, that it'll take a significant community engagement process, education process, to have endorser supporters that come from all sorts of different parts of the community, and that opposition to it, like any measure, doesn't need the sorts of resources and organization as proponents do. It's just easier to convince somebody to be no than it is to yes, and we're asking them to be yes to something that they're unfamiliar with. So, if that's big, medium, or small, sort of, you can make your judgment, but certainly a lot of community engagement, a lot of education, a lot of community endorsers, and be aware that if an opposition campaign emerged, that they could be effective.
I think you've answered my question as well as is possible. I understand that you said at the beginning that's not what this is for, but is there, at this point in a process, is there any way to compare this to the infrastructure bond that this community did? And I don't know if that's a question you could answer or staff.
We did focus groups for infrastructure bond as well as a survey, and there was some doubt about those in those focus groups. There was less doubt in those focus groups than there was in the ones we just did.
And beyond the doubt aspect, were there any other things that stood out? Like, is this one more vulnerable to an opposition in comparison to the bond? And was the other one more easy to persuade?
Well, the bond had one crucial element is that we were asking people to support maintaining their taxes, their property taxes at their current rate. And whether it's a bond for in Salem or it's a levy in some other community, being able to tell voters you get good stuff without having a tax increase is a whole heck of a lot easier to get them to yes than to say a new mechanism and additional revenue. And so those are just very big differences between the two measures or the two issues.
I think this is my last follow-up question. So in comparison to the infrastructure bond, I feel like we got this information, 10 months earlier. Is that about accurate? A year, 10 months earlier?
I think so. The measure was what, November 2022? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And then I think we did the research. I think we started the research like winter 2021, if I recall, and then into the spring 2022. I'd have to go back and look, but I think that's right.
Okay. Yeah.
Other questions? Councilor Hoy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You may have said this and I missed it, but was the focus group asked how they might feel about this going up for a vote or the possibility that council may make the decision?
I can't recall if it wasn't a big part of the conversation. I can't recall if it was asked directly or not. I have done lots of research in other places where in any number of issues, if you give the choice to voters, should you have the power to make this decision or should somebody else have the power to make the decision? They're going to say 9 times out of 10 it should go to the voters. I have no reason to think that the voters would respond differently now, but that obviously councils make decisions for voters' behalf all the time. But if you put the question to them, that's usually where they end up. Yeah.
Other questions? Councilor Nordyke.
Thank you. So one of the first slides under key takeaways, which is page 25 in the packet, says that the notion that the city's funding is sufficient but not adequately budgeted towards preferred priority areas, such as homelessness services, is a prevalent theme throughout group discussions. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, so again, the everyday voter in Salem and other communities doesn't come with a detailed level of information about a city budget, nor lots of detailed information about how things are financed. And even if they know how things are financed, how those mechanisms work. But there is in this country today, and in Oregon today, and in Salem today, just doubt that government is effectively delivering services, and those spill over into Salem. They can certainly, I can't remember specifically these examples came up in these groups, but they probably did, will say things like, why doesn't transportation and water coordinate their services? It seems like they tear up a road and then tear it up again. Or, that's a classic one that comes up. Why do they have so many, people standing around not fixing the pothole? I mean, those sorts of things come up over and over again. And that's connected to, as well, what they sense is Salem cannot meet our concern around addressing homelessness, and then doubt about government's ability to solve problems. Now, that's not held by everybody, and people might hold that opinion and still support increased revenue. But when people are frustrated about the way things are going and can point to specific things that they don't feel like are getting better, it raises doubt about being able to deliver on other programs and services that they might be asked to support.
Thank you. And I guess my follow-up has to do with how this slide relates to some of the other slides. There were several slides that talked about if you had to cut, where would you cut? or what would you least likely want to cut? And that appears to relate to what that sentence says, which is that the funding is sufficient, but not adequately budgeted towards preferred priority areas. The way I read this, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that folks want us to spend more of our existing funding on homelessness. Based on isn't that what the takeaway is from your?
I would say if we asked that question, they probably would have said yes, because that's the question maybe we would have asked to them directly. I mean, another way to might think about it is, does the voter think that homelessness is being solved and that resources might be able to address it? And I think that it's pretty clear in these groups that they're concerned about homelessness and they think that resources might be able to address it, and that's in part why option C, the 0.66 option, had the plurality support.
Okay, the next question I had, there were several references to a preference for a tax structure that provides exemptions for lower wage earners. I don't suppose lower wage was defined at any point in time?
No, not really. I mean, we heard some numbers in the groups, but I wouldn't, they're in the transcript, so I hesitate even to say them because it might set an idea. But I'd say, people who are making minimum wage, not much above minimum wage, are the sorts of people that they are considering.
Okay.
Yeah.
Other questions? Councillor Hoy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This may not be a question for you, but it's come to mind. And that is, first of all, a short statement that I am one of those people who didn't understand at all how this stuff works. And it's not because I'm not smart, it's not because the voters are not smart. It's because we're trusting that there are people in these positions doing these jobs and doing them right and out for the best interest of the rest of us. That's where I was at in this. I'm not saying I'm not still there. I'm just saying I know more now than I ever did, and more than I ever wanted to know, frankly. I have other things I'd love to use my bandwidth for, but I am where I am. Is there anything that we could do to educate better, short of sounding condescending, about matters like these?
So I very much appreciate that question and perspective. One thing I would want to emphasize, not just here today, but just in the work that I do in the community, is to say that a voter or the typical voter might not know X or might not have technical information is not to say that they don't know what they value. And please know that they know what they value, and they can sense whether or not they're getting good value for what they pay. So I definitely want to just emphasize that point. I'm not sure if you were saying that or saying something else, but that's something that made me think. And then I actually lost track. What was the second part of your?
Is there anything we could do to better educate?
I've been at this a long time. Yes, every community should be working to educate their constituents about, say, how property taxes work in Oregon, as an example. But one of the things we heard in this focus group, I can remember the moment where somebody said, well, they need to put limits on property taxes. Well, Oregon has all sorts of limits on property taxes. We've had our property tax system now for, 30 years or something, whatever it is. To say that I'm doubtful is probably more pessimistic than I mean, but I think successful asks to the voters have some common elements. One, it's aligned with their needs. Two, they have confidence that the services are going to be delivered. And it's a mechanism that they can support. Whether we can educate the community about financing in general, I guess I am doubtful. But whether or not we could talk to the community about how this might benefit them, meet their needs, that I've got a confidence communities can do that. The Salem could do that.
That's what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Other questions? Councilor Phillips.
Yeah, thank you. If you could just summarize the the 2 or 3 kind of big values things. I mean, I think I've heard homelessness and I think I've heard equitable. Is that accurate or?
Oh, those are definitely accurate. Those are big ones that are themes from these groups.
Yeah.
Right? And then I think, just from other work that we've done, people want to feel safe. People want to see their community thrive. They want to see a place where their kids can stay. They want to have enjoyable amenities. They want to go and have fun and enjoy each other's company. I mean, those are the big themes of any community. In these particular groups, because of what we're talking about, homelessness came up, so prominently. But I'd say those other things are certainly there too.
Thank you.
Councillor Stapleton.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on that. Is it safe to assume that if we shifted all of the money to taking care of homelessness but closed our library and our parks and our Center 50 Plus, that there would not be a positive response to that?
There would not be a positive response to that. I feel confident in saying that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. There are trade-offs. We got 2 hours with these folks. We did not run through every single trade-off, right? So prioritizing homelessness, I don't think that they would come to you and say that means I'm willing to cut other services to the bone that I value. They are counting on you to help them think through what those trade-offs are, though. Yeah.
Sort of back to Councillor Hoy's question about educating the community and how can we do that? I'm wondering, because we've been hearing for a number of years about homelessness being the number one priority and that the city's not doing enough. But we've done some educating about that at times, and that changes that opinion. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that in terms of these focus groups.
So I've been saying homelessness is a priority concern. That's true. What is left unsaid with that comment, though, is that people think about homelessness very differently. And when people say that homelessness is my number one concern, they can be saying very different things. For some of them, for some, it's definitely housing affordability. And there's different ways to deliver that. People might conceive it differently, but it's on that side of the ledger. A lot of folks are talking about mental health and drug addiction. These focus groups can't tell me on balance where Salem is at. A lot of other work that I've done would say it's kind of a 60-40 proposition. About 40% of at least Oregonians think it is more on housing affordability and about 60% on mental health and drug addiction. So when I say homelessness is the number one concern, know too that the community probably isn't aligned exactly with what that means. When people articulate that homelessness is the number one concern, what they, I think, primarily are thinking about is visible homelessness, unsheltered camping types of situations. They want to see that diminished, and they probably have different solutions for that. Many of them are going to want to see that coupled with some sort of enforcement, drug addiction treatment, mental health interventions, and that is their primary concern. And then I'd say a large minority, but significant, are going to prioritize some sort of housing. And these things aren't mutually exclusive. People can hold both, but on balance, that's what we've been hearing in a lot of the work that we've done around this. I'm not sure if that answers your question,
It
Mayor,
does.
but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions for Mr. Horvick? Councilor Varney.
Thank you very much. I was kind of curious. 2 hours isn't very much time, and that was 2 hours total per
group. It's both a lot of time for those participants and not much time in the overall scheme of things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Since you said you spent a lot of time communicating with them, what sort of information did you provide them for background information?
Not a lot. So we provided them a bit in terms of here's the city's financial situation, the size of the deficit, and that these are these rates that may get you part of the way there, kind of meet current needs and maybe solve some additional challenges. That is a limitation in this research. And so obviously I would say, continue to do community outreach because there's more education, there's more input that the community could provide. It's also pretty realistic insofar as most people, if it went to the ballot, the reality is most voters are going to come and the most time that they will spend it is when they look at their voter's pamphlet and make a decision, yes or no on it. So to the extent that they were insufficiently informed, that probably is close to mirroring what an actual electoral reality is.
Okay. I'm concerned about the small sample size.
Sure, me too.
And as Councilor Gwynn said, I was wondering how many of them are homeowners paying property tax? How many are not? How many are business owners? Because all of that is going to impact them. I mean, when I look at the curve and confidence intervals, it'd be really interesting to do it again and compare the results.
Sure.
I'm just really curious.
Yeah,
Anyway,
me too.
just
I'd
some
be very
comments.
curious too. Yeah, I would say, again, I think focus groups are really good at raising people's our understanding of people's concerns, the range of different perspectives that are out there, probably some guidance on whether people are leaning left or right or, whatever sort of directions. But yeah, yes, you sample. This is not a sample size of 400, 500, 600, whatever. It's an in-depth conversation with 18 randomly selected people who we think look like likely voters in November, odd number election. But yeah, you should absolutely consider the number of people we talk to.
Okay, that kind of led to one other question I had going into that. So you said randomly selected. I'm just trying, did some of them refuse?
Oh, sure. Not every, from a pollster's perspective, from a researcher's perspective, I wish everybody we reached out to said yes,
Okay.
but that doesn't happen. So of course there is, people refuse, people don't have time on their calendars, they're not available that day, they, whatever sorts of reasons people might have. So yeah, I think we started from like 30,000 names and contacts. We randomize those or reach out to folks, and we try to find people who are available and willing to talk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you
Yeah.
for the information. I really appreciate it. Very interesting.
Thanks.
Other questions? Sure. Councilor Nordike.
Thank you. A great discussion. So I'm now looking at another key takeaway slide. It's slide 26 in our materials. And when I look at the three top reasons participants came up with in support of the payroll tax, let me just summarize them. First is need. The payroll tax will help the city make up its budget deficit and allow it to maintain its current level of services. Homelessness. Revenue generated will support homelessness programming. And 3, fairness. All employees, including those who come to work here but don't live here, will contribute. And the final bullet point that I would add, if I was looking at creating a voter's pamphlet statement, would be low-wage earners exempt. I mean, these are 4 bullet points that you could put in a voter's pamphlet. They're easy to understand. They're the ones that resonate with this focus group. Are these difficult? These don't sound like difficult concepts to me to put in a voter's pamphlet. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Well, those were the takeaways. Those are the things that they told us. So to the extent that, they came up with those ideas, I didn't have to persuade them of them. Those are when we asked, what are the reasons? The exercise we did in the groups was, we asked people to wear a hat, run the campaign for the pro side, and convince your neighbors that this is a good idea. And these are the things that they said to each other were the reasons to support. And they were understandable to each other. Now, not everybody agreed with them, but those were the things that they came up with themselves, that they would tell each other, and there wasn't confusion in the groups about what people were talking about.
And I think that's what I'm trying to get at, because there's a lot of fear that people won't understand why we're taking a payroll tax to voters. There's a lot of fear the voters won't get it. There's not enough time to educate them. There's not enough time for them to understand it between now and then. But when I see those 4 bullet points that I just read off, those aren't complicated. And what I'm hearing from you is that in the focus group, these were not confusing concepts, at least among those people gathered.
They weren't confusing concepts. They're also being weighed against reasons that people gave to oppose. But no, people weren't confused. They did, I'd say, kind of enter again, kind of repeating myself a bit on this one, but they did not walk in the group saying the way to fund things is employee payroll tax. That's not the idea that they came up with. So they had to reason through that, think about it, understand why it might work. But then those were the reasons that they came up with, and yeah, they understood them and they were able to articulate them to each other.
And I think the follow-up question I have, and I think you're leading me down that point, how many people changed their minds about going from no, I would not support a payroll tax to yes, I would, after these concepts were explained to them?
Not that many. Not that many. But there's also weren't that many that I think were absolutely dead set in their position.
Can you help me understand what you mean by not that many?
Oh, single digits. I didn't keep track of it in those ways. And so it's more, my feel and sort of like kind of listening to words more than counting things up. But that's also not uncommon. Once people have been talking about an issue for a couple hours, they've said where they stand. They said where they stand in front of others. It can be difficult to get them to move. But I don't think very many people left the group. No, some did, but I don't think by and large they left the groups set in their positions one side or the other. There are a few. There are some exceptions, but.
Other questions for Mr. Harvick? Councilor Phillips.
Yeah, I really appreciate the discussion. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, John. When we had the infrastructure bond as the most, recent comparison, I remember at some point there were numbers, and I'm probably a bit off base, but, initially people, when, I don't know if it was a focus group or later on with polling, but they were thinking maybe 45, 48% support. And then when you explained to them for no new taxes, it went up to like 58 or 60%.
Yeah, I can't remember the numbers, but that's my recollection of sort of the kind of soft kind of ambivalence to pretty strong support once they understood that it would not increase taxes. Yeah.
So it was a pretty clear jump of, maybe 10% give or take.
Yeah.
Is there any corollary like that in this? And at what point in the process do you get that type of information? I think that counts.
That's really beyond what I think that these groups could do.
Did they come out, like when we did the infrastructure bond, did we get it in the focus group or did we get it with polling later on? Okay.
Well, but it was, so in the focus groups, we did present people sort of information the same way we did in the survey, which is here's the thing the city might do. And then we had and I can't remember exactly what the percentages were, the numbers were, and then give people additional information about, you can get these benefits without, increasing your tax rates. If you wanted to find an analogy here, it would be, and I don't really think this is probably a good one, but the analogy would be, it's going to pay for the thing that you most value. Where in the bond measure, it's going to pay for all sorts of different things that you cared about, but no new taxes. But here, potentially, it could be allocated to the thing that you say is the highest priority.
And I guess my follow-up that I didn't expect to have is at this point, I'm hearing that polling is when we learned that it was like a 10% swing or more, when we explained the relatively easy thing to explain that there's no new taxes. Oh man, I just forgot my question. It was there and then it disappeared.
It's a good one too.
Yeah, it was, but darn it.
You'll come back.
It'll come back.
Yeah, or it won't.
Other questions for Mr. Harvick? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
This has been really helpful. I appreciate it. And I think we are on back to Josh. Oh, hold on, John. It came back.
There. I'm only 45. Was there, at the beginning you said that this isn't an easy lift. This is not set up to give us the specifics that we get from polling. You can't generalize this data. It gives us the range and then the intensity. Did the infrastructure bond seem like an easier lift?
Yes.
Okay. Did it seem like an easy lift?
No.
Okay. No. Thank you.
I knew it was a good one. All right, Josh.
Good evening. I have just a few slides for you. A lot of the material you've seen before at our other 2 work sessions, and then a little bit of new information. Just real quick, the goals of the work session. You've seen these before. Address the gap between cost of services and available revenues. Avoid cuts to critical community services. Replace funding for some public safety services. And then provide funding for day-to-day operations of new bond-funded facilities. And the city operations fee increase, I think we covered that at the budget committee meetings in depth. And then we've talked tonight more about the employee paid payroll tax with the option A, B, and C. And I'm going to walk through those just to remind everyone what's included. Option A, and these three groups have some very similar components. Community policing, baseline policing, so covering some existing services and then increasing by 13 FTE. Expanding the homeless outreach team by 3 officers, the new fire station, some funding for the navigation center, and then the existing airport safety and security, and then some support services. So the difference you'll see on the next couple slides is in the navigation center and the shelter sites. This option B, slightly higher rate, you see it's still not full funding for the navigation center. The full funding would be $2.4 million, and then some funding for a single shelter site. So this would be relying on community partners to make up the difference, or reducing the service to fit into the amount available. Option C, the 0.661, a little change since last time that we spoke. It includes full funding for the navigation center, full funding for the 3 current shelter sites, continues the towing program for the RVs and other abandoned vehicles that are out there that are extremely difficult to dispose of, and then the mobile crisis response. And this could be formed as an incentive for Polk or Marion County to concentrate some of their non-sworn mental health support for the Salem area. So those are the differences between option A, B, and C. And I'm going to stop there just for a quick second, see if there's any questions on those.
Councilor Nishioka.
Thank you, Mayor Hoy. Can you tell me about the towing program, if it's in existence now, or if this is something that's being added, and is that a reasonable amount?
Oh,
Anybody
Gretchen is here. Gretchen, would you like to speak to that? I was looking around.
I thought that's who you were looking for.
She was tucked back.
Good evening, everyone. Gretchen Bennett, Liaison on Homelessness Issues. Yes, the towing program is in existence now and is supported through our Community and Urban Development Department. It helps us with responding to and having a place to take those vehicles that are unsafe and derelict. And so this, as I understand it, would be able to continue that past when our one-time funding runs out. Is it adequate? I think right now we're spending at a level that's within the budget. So I would say that. What we have that's not adequate is adequate spaces for the safe parking sites. There's a lot of room for building additional spaces within the existing contract that we have for safe park programs.
So then that leads into, if I may have another question, some of these fundings then do not include safe parking, or it does?
It does not, but what this does include is continuing the general fund safe park program as part of, it would address the structural deficit, which helps continue those programs.
So those would continue?
In these scenarios, yes.
Okay. As long as we were at this level of tax?
Correct, yes.
Thank you.
Other questions? Councilor Varney.
Thank you. And actually, it was for Gretchen. Sorry about that. Well, I was just wondering, you indicated that there is a need for more safe park sites. Is there a cost to maintaining those? What sort of supportive services are provided? And if we increase the number of them, wouldn't that increase the costs for that program?
Thank you, Councilor Varney. At some point there would be, but the current agreement that we have provides for the support necessary for more safe park sites than we have currently. I can't remember the precise number, but I believe we could almost double the number of sites that we have before exceeding what the contract capacity would be. if a property owner of land was interested in learning about that, the amenities include some sort of chemical toilet or porta potty or wait for someone to use the restroom. We need to have a place for disposal of garbage. And then there's people who visit throughout the evening to check on safety and security and address issues. And there's also an intake and management process for folks. During the day, people come for case management at a different location than the overnight Safe Park sites. So we'd love to talk to anyone who's interested in hearing more about the program.
Okay, thank you very, very much. That was very helpful.
Most of those support services are centralized at the former DMV site on Portland Road. And so that's how we can expand the locations without significantly expanding the cost, because they're going to a central location rather than the support services going out to them. Councillor Stapleton.
Thank you. Just to be clear, I see 33 new FTE on this largest, I guess, option C being the largest percentage. But our staffing reports as of late, we are in the 300 realm of needed FTE to kind of be up to full functioning as a city. Is that a good way of saying that?
In order to meet the deferred need that's been identified, yeah, that's correct. 308 positions.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Folks, I would just say that this is probably, I don't want to say the last time, but probably the last substantial time when we have to really dedicate to these questions and this topic before we're likely to face some sort of decision point. So certainly you'll have individual opportunities, but probably the last time we'll have a collective. So this is definitely the time to get any questions that you've been wondering about, things you're not sure about, any of those sorts of things. This is definitely the time to address those. Councillor Stapleton.
I'll use the time to also state some things that I'm really interested in seeing as we move forward, if that's okay with you, Mayor.
Sure.
Josh, is it possible to make a payroll tax be exempt for workers that are earning under $15 an hour?
Yes, and actually I have that here in a couple slides.
Oh, should I stop talking then?
I'm happy to address whatever else you have also.
Okay, I will ask my other one. And it actually has to do with operations fee. I want to talk about equity for a few minutes. The operations fee has the ability to have a mechanism in there so that people who are struggling with lower incomes could qualify for financial assistance and have fees waived. Is that something that we can, staff can bring forward, a policy change to our current structure for financial aid, to have that be just for low income earners, be available to them to have support?
If I'm understanding correctly, you're referring to the current discount program we have for water, wastewater
Yes.
operations fee. We'd have to look at it and see what that does and what our limitations are with the current system. Because I know that it just kind of depends. Are you looking at a separate discount or expanding that? Because it does discount for utilities also. So if you're looking for a different discount, it'd be another line, and we have to look at the feasibility of doing that.
Yeah, and I think what I'm interested in is, the way I understand it is we have 3 qualifiers, folks who are seniors, folks who are struggling with disabilities, and folks with low income. And they have to be 2 of those things. And I'm hoping that we can do something where it would be just if a qualifier for just low income. Is that something we can do?
We can certainly look into it, yes.
Okay, those are some equity pieces that I am wanting to see as we move forward. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Additional questions, or should we let Josh continue on with his slides? Let's do that and see if we come up with some more questions.
You've seen this slide before. It just shows the impact of these base rates for hourly wage, annual wage, and then broken down monthly and annually. The highlighted line there in the middle, it's a little hard to see, but it's the Salem median household income. So it's not quite a per capita, it's not quite a per worker, but you could equate that to the city operations fee for a residential unit. It's a house. So you can see for the highest rate, 661, we're looking at $34.25 monthly and $411 total for the year. And then as promised, unfortunately very small, it is in your packet, so you should be able to see it. I'll introduce this. The A, B, and C align to the three scenarios that we've looked at this evening. There in the first column that's in boxes, you can see the base rate, the 0.0049, the 0.0056, and the 0.00661. Below that, the next section, you can see the impact of those for the median family income that we just talked about, that $62,185. When we move to the right, you can see what that rate needs to adjust to with various levels of exemption. For that first column, minimum wage, currently $13.50, soon to be $14.20. So you can see what that rate would have to be if you exempted minimum wage. The next column is up to $15 an hour, so it's inclusive of a minimum wage exemption. And then the same for $18 per hour and $20 per hour. And then you can see the corresponding annual impact on that median family income. So I'll just stop here. I know I had several of you reach out with scenarios. I hope I captured them all. If I didn't, I'm happy to run additional scenarios. I will say at $20 per hour exemption, you're looking at about 30% of the tax base. So you're looking at some very significant portions that you'd be exempting. That's why the rate gets much, much higher, like a 0.95% of subject wages. And I did use census data to come up with this. I applied it to the Department of Revenue data that we received. We did review it, and this is probably the best estimate we have right now. Of course, the actuals, they're going to vary. It's going to look different. Even if you pulled the trigger today and we implemented it here in the next year and a half, likely wages shift around, but this is our best estimate right now.
Questions about exemption options? Councilor Nordyke.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you, Josh, for including these exemption options. I have been very concerned about making minimum wage earners pay. And I'm pleased to see these options before us. I want to make sure I'm reading the charts right, though. So looking at slide 68, which is on our screen, so that's always helpful for folks watching at home. Under family income, let me rephrase. Under annual impact for a median family income of $62,185, I'm looking at, for example, option C. If you exempted minimum wage earners, their rate would be $506.19. I have that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Annually.
Annually, thank you. And if we bumped up the exemption rate to include people making $15 per hour or less, it goes from $506 to $522 per year. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And the only reason I say that is that is a change, but it's not an enormous change. It really starts to increase once you start looking at exempting $18 an hour, because then it jumps from $522 to $559. Or if you go up to $20 an hour, it goes from $522 to $592. So I just wanted to point that out for my colleagues. I'm still very, very much in favor of exempting minimum wage workers. And I was thinking before I came here tonight, would I be supportive of a rate above that? 'Cause surely it's not only minimum wage people who are struggling. And I'm not seeing, it might make a world of difference to our $15 per hour people without making a huge impact in what the rate would be. So for example, under payroll tax option C, the amount would go from $42.18 to $43.56. Am I still understanding that correct, Josh?
Can you?
I'm looking at the bottom, that bottom
monthly
column, the very bottom one, C. Just want to make sure I'm understanding what that means.
Yeah, that's correct. So go from 42.18 to 43.56 for the minimum wage versus the $15 per hour. In those lower wage brackets, the bands are pretty small for the incremental increases.
Right. So, I mean, I have a lot of concerns about not taking this to the voters that I'm still mulling through. And I'm still, looking forward to talking to, I have some neighborhood association groups coming up that I can't wait to hear from them about this. If we do pursue a payroll tax, I would be in favor of exempting the $15 per hour folks and under, because I'm not seeing an enormous jump in the rate for everybody else, but I know for people who make $15 an hour, every penny really counts. So that's where I'm leaning at this point. But like I said, I still have to talk to a lot of people and get input from my constituents in Ward 7. Thanks.
Thank you, Counselor. Josh, I too am interested in some sort of exemption, and I'm not sure yet where I'm landing in terms of a proposal. But I'm wondering about if we do something other than minimum wage, how would you word that because the minimum wage is constantly adjusting. So how would you word that in a way that actually made that practical? So if we said, if we just say minimum wage, that's easy because the state sets that, and then it is what it is. But if we were to say $15 an hour, well, next year the minimum wage might be above that. So how would we word that in a way that was effective to capture our intent?
Yeah. So if you just said $15 or less, you would be elapsed, and everyone would be paying the same rate within 1 or 2 years. The same thing would have happened previously with the last payroll tax measure. There were 2 rates, and the second rate would sunset likely in the same time span that we're talking about. It was at $15. It would be challenging, I think. There are some additional challenges just with the administration piece. And I should note that I included 2 more FTE in those right scenarios for administration, just for communication, a lot more working with employers.
That was to your point that the more complex we make it, the harder it is to administer.
Yeah, correct. Right. I think the only practical way to do that is to include some kind of inflationary measure. Again, it's hard to communicate to employers, and it would be a change every year, right? It'd be different than setting the rate, and it's easy when you know what minimum wage is. Otherwise, you're looking at it's going to be $15 this year. It's going to be $15.83, and then it's going to be $16.24. It'll just change and adjust each year.
So maybe that's something to give some thought to, not for tonight, but maybe for the future. Like, say, look at a scenario, how you could word it, say minimum wage plus 1% or 2%. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but some way that isn't automatically indexing rate, so we don't get ourselves into a jam at some point. So that's something I'd be interested in the future. I think I saw Hoy, Varney, and I think maybe everybody has their hands up. So we'll just start. We'll start down the row.
I'll be quick because that's exactly what I was after. As an employer, we've watched minimum wage go up. And when would this be implemented? Because we're going to be at $15 an hour in 2025, I think. So we would have to, I think it was Councilor Stapleton that said we should exempt minimum wage workers under $15 an hour, but everyone will be at $15 an hour at minimum wage in 2025. So
yeah, that's very likely. Yes.
Yeah. P.S. Little funny side note, numbers, you'll love this. My husband did some math. When we bought the restaurant 6 years ago, minimum wage was what it was. As of last week, we are paying $5,000 more a month because of the increases in minimum wage and labor costs alone. It makes a difference to everyone, what goes on. So,
Councilor Varney.
Thank you very much, Mayor Hoy. I wanted to make sure I understand this rate table, and it's really, really excellent. It gives a different perspective, and also thank you, Councilor Nordyke, for pointing out that difference between 15 and 18. I appreciate that. So my question is, there's a target revenue of, say, letter C of $27,850,000. I'm curious about the pool of the payroll tax contributors, because in the slide that talks about it, it's on wages for services performed in Salem. So my question is, did this include people who work for employers based in Salem, but maybe they don't work in Salem?
It's likely. There's limitations to the data that we have access to. We've been in discussions, finance and the legal department. Dan's done some great research on this, on the basis for the tax, whether it should be based on the employer location or where the work is performed. There's certainly advantages to both. The simplicity of the employer location and the administration makes that a little more attractive, but there are some pros and cons to each approach.
Okay, but this particular one is just based on people who work in Salem.
So I would say that would be the most conservative approach, and it would be accurate with the data. If you expanded it to all the work performed in Salem, it's likely a little bit more than that revenue. But again, we won't know until we're actually in the process and actually implementing it.
Okay, but you had to come up with the rate using a certain number of contributors, right? And so
Correct.
That's why I was wondering.
Correct. So it's based on employment data from the Department of Revenue for their state transit tax for Salem employers.
Okay, thank you.
My key takeaways on this are really the numbers that we can control are the rate and what the exemption is, but we really, the target revenue is really just an estimate. I mean, we don't know what that number truly is going to be until we have some experience.
Yeah, that's 100% accurate, and I would encourage the council that when we get to that point where you're adding services, you add it correspondingly with what the actual revenue we receive. So we need to have a true up at some point.
Right. Thank you. I lost track. Who has a hand? Councilor Phillips.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Josh, for this. I support the exemption. We write it about $15 per hour, so I asked for that with an email. You included that and more, so thank you. I do want to understand what I'm asking for, though. I do think that I understand the trade-offs, like it'll be at a higher rate for people that make more than $15 an hour, or we would have to decrease the number of like new FT and new funds to make it more palatable. So, do I understand that trade-off correctly? Like the rate went up. It's up from, 0.661, and in this case, at $15 an hour, it's a rate of it's 0.084.
0.814, I think.
Yeah, okay. So, I guess my question is, practically speaking, what happens for the person that's making a little more than $15 an hour? Are we exempting every dollar that's made up to the equivalent of $15 an hour for an entire year, and then we tax above that? Or does somebody who makes, $100 more get taxed like the entire amount because they're above our threshold?
So there's no marginal tax rate. So it's a clean cutoff. So if you make $15, you're exempt. If you make $15.01, you're not.
Okay.
So those people right on the bubble are not going to be in a great position in terms of the tax. They're going to probably be impacted more.
Yeah, so
it's a very small amount, I will say. I think it's about 9 cents. So as long as you get more than a 9-cent raise, if you're making $15, you would be covering the tax per hour.
Okay, so for that first 10-cent difference, it's all consumed by this. And then if you're above that, okay, it's a small amount, but there's no way to account for that weird bubble.
Not practically, no.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? Councilor Gwynn.
This is probably going to sound like a silly question, but do you know what the payroll tax is in Eugene? And I'm asking because there was oh, you do? Okay. Because there was an article in the paper saying that people in Eugene making $20 an hour pay about $7 and that Salem would be less. But when I calculate it, even at the lowest, the 0.49%, it's $16.99 a month. And at the 661, it's $22.91. So ours is going to be higher than Eugene regardless, right?
So it's really difficult to compare the two for a couple of reasons. One, Eugene has a couple different components. They have an employer rate and an employee rate. They also have a self-employment rate. We'd like to include that in our structure as well. But it makes it a little hard to compare. I'm not familiar with the article, but I can certainly look at it. But our rate that we're looking at are all more than their 0.44, so it's going to be higher.
But in all of your scenarios so far, we're not contemplating an employer rate at all. So there's that whole stream of revenue that's not included in ours.
That is correct, yes.
Other questions? Do you have more slides? Councilor Nordyke.
I know it's an employee paid payroll tax and not an employer, but if the employer pays him or herself a salary, are they paying the tax?
Yeah, so what would happen is if you're paid with a W-2, you're going to pay the same employee payroll tax. If you're paying yourself with like a K-1 or a partnership return, it's going to fall into the self-employment tax, or if you're a contract employer. With it, correct, yes.
Councilor Gwynn.
Have you determined what the self-employment tax would be?
Currently, it's contemplated to be the same, but that is, of course, a council policy decision.
Other questions? Councilor Nishioka.
Thank you. Just to be clear, we keep talking about value of earnings per hour, so $20 per hour, but salary, this is somebody making a salary, it's still going to be equivalent to whatever it is they're making per hour. Correct? I just want to make sure that there's clarity on that.
Yeah, that is correct. We're looking at exemptions on an hourly basis, but the entire concept of the tax is more just on wages. So the hourly piece only comes into play if you would fall into one of those exemptions if council were to adopt it. But there's lots of other ways that people are paid on commission or bonuses or piecework and things like that. Those would all apply. They would have to be converted to hourly if they're low enough, which is, again, a complication that employers would have to work through.
Do you have more slides, Josh?
Just one quick slide on timeline. We talked about the city operations fee. The payroll tax, if it's referred to voters, effective as early as January 2025. If it's not referred to voters, it potentially could be sooner. In both cases, it's a very aggressive implementation timeline. There's a lot of pieces that have to fall into place. Just want to have that on the record. And then just next steps, if there's any questions, we are looking for direction. We're not looking for you to have to build a proposal right now, but just general direction, then coming back with something if that's what council would like.
Thanks, Josh. I would like to just open it up. I see all of our presenters are still here. So if anybody has thought of questions for anybody who's presented tonight, I think now I want to be able to ask all of those questions right now. So, and not just the last presenter. So if you have any questions about anything we've discussed tonight or any of those topics, now would be a great time to get those out. Councilor Varney, you look like you want to raise your hand, but you're not. There you go. All right, Councilor Varney.
Well, I was just wondering because I think most of my questions are probably for Josh, and they're just kind of general questions. I do have some concerns about what the stated aggressive timeline here, especially when I go back and look at Eugene's. When the council approved it in June of 2019, it didn't take effect until January of 2021. And then you're looking at collecting revenues. I mean, this is when the council approved it, and it's still a 2-year lag. So that concerns me in itself. And if it goes to the voters, I see this as being even later, potentially. So I'm just expressing a concern with that. So, anyway, I wanted to mention that if it did go to the voters and it did not pass, I was curious with the reductions that we had talked about, will any of those have impacts on the cost of housing? here in Salem? I know that's kind of a broad, general question, but I'm thinking about planning, building, other things.
As probably the not as qualified person to answer this question, I think any reductions to service affects the quality of life in Salem and could impact housing value.
I
Okay.
think Mr. Staley has some more to add to that.
If you're referring to our ability to process permits, for example,
Or whatever,
and
yeah.
the drag that would have on the process, certainly that would add to the cost of construction. Time is money, so not having people in the system to do that work, we're already stretched from a planning perspective. So certainly, if we don't have those people, the timelines associated with our permitting and development process are going to be impacted. Although permitting and development is funded through permit fees and revenues, generally speaking, that are not included in the general fund.
Okay, that helps a lot. Thank you for clarifying it. So also, if we didn't get this revenue, we've had some discussions about the impact on our credit rating. And so how would it impact our credit rating?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. It's going to be a little nuanced. It really depends how fast things happen and if there's a plan for the future. So, for example, we just sold $100 million of bonds, the first issuance of 3. We'll be looking to do it again here in a couple of years. If we deplete fund balance and we don't have a plan to replenish it, it's going to be very concerning to the rating agencies. And, you know, yeah, it would likely lead to a downgrade. That wouldn't surprise me at all.
Which would mean that we wouldn't be able to fund as many projects.
That's correct. So what it does is you're not as competitive, so you get a higher interest rate, which costs taxpayers more. So when we go to issue $100 million, and that's what we have capacity for, maybe we'd have to downsize that to 80 million or something to fit within our debt service schedule if we're expecting a higher interest rate.
Okay, thank you. That's right.
Josh, to the last point, or maybe a point ago, could you just remind the public and maybe members of council, when we're talking about this, we're talking about general fund departments only. So we're not talking about all city services because, like Mr. Staley just referenced, certain things are covered by fees, certain things are in their own fund, not the general fund. Could you just sort of give us a really, I think, as detailed as you can, outline of the departments that are in the general fund and those that aren't?
Sure, happy to. I'm going to use a cheat sheet
That's
because there's a
fine.
lot. So
Yeah.
the budget the budget committee just recommended approximately 750 million. The general fund's 185 of that, so it's not anywhere close to everything that the city does. Some of the other things we've talked about: building and safety, transportation services, so street and sidewalk maintenance, the streetlight fund, airport, community renewal, so that's CDBG and home funds.
These are all things that are not in the general fund.
Correct. Downtown parking, culture and tourism, so that's the transient occupancy tax, public art, tourism promotion, our leasehold fund, general debt service, all our capital improvement funds. The utility is probably the largest one. It's more comparable to the general fund, completely separate. Emergency medical services, Willamette Valley Community Call Center, police regional records, our city services funds, so that's like fleet services, radio services. Our self-insurance funds are separate. Equipment replacement reserve, and then our trust funds, which are funds that are held for a specific purpose or restricted use. So those are all outside of the general funds.
So the things in the general fund: police, fire, parks, library, internal services. Anything else?
City manager's office, community urban development, enterprise services, fire, legal, finance, mayor and council, municipal court, community services, parks, library, Center 50 Plus, the police department, social service grants.
Thank you. I just think it's important to remember that we're only talking about, what, a third of the general fund? I mean, a third of the overall budget.
Correct.
Is the general fund. So it's really a small piece of the things that we really have a lot of flexibility with. So, yeah. Councilor Stapleton.
I have an odd question, and I'm not sure if I've asked it before or not, which makes it even more challenging for me. Sorry. So we know that, I think it's Ryan, who does a lot of work on flood mitigation and therefore reduces the rate that people pay for their flood insurance on their homes. Do I have the right person?
Not quite. So that's our development services group
Okay.
in Public Works. But
Okay.
yes, they do
Yes,
do a
they
lot
do
of
do
work.
that work.
and-
Okay.
Yes.
Is there a chance that if we do not fully fund or better fund our fire department, and we get to a place where we cannot guarantee a response time for certain people in our community, that their home insurance will increase?
I think there's the potential. I think in my personal life, when you apply for insurance, they ask how close a fire station is. So yes, I think it's impactful.
Okay, thanks.
I don't know. Does the fire chief want to opine?
Fire Chief Mike Nip, that is accurate. So when you ask for home insurance, the first question they ask is, where's the nearest fire station? They Google, they Google it, and then sometimes they call us and say, hey, this person's applying for insurance, and that's a pretty routine thing to happen. So you start closing stations in your community, then your travel time is longer. Like I talked about the other night for response time, so that can have an impact on people's ability to get a reduced rate in their fire insurance.
Chief, I don't want to put you on the spot. If you don't want to answer this question, it's okay. But I imagine, because I know that you like to plan and think ahead about things. So these scenarios that we've talked about with potentially closing 2 fire stations should the revenue not be sufficient. Do you know which 2 stations those would be that you would pick first, or have you not gotten that far yet?
No, I have a general idea. There's some options, but what we're doing right now is it's not a fun exercise, but we're looking at impact. What would be the most impactful? And I hesitate to name them, but if you want me to, I can. I can tell you the 3 I'm thinking about, but I think that might just cause an uproar in the community for the people who live around those stations. Would be like, what, you're closing my station? So till we get to that point, I've had to do this before. It's not a fun exercise. I had hoped not to do it for the rest of my career, but we may have to cross that bridge. So we'll be prepared with what we think is the best course of action.
So just in general terms, without naming names, you would pick the 2 stations that you could best cover from somewhere else, and that would just mean that another station would be covering a larger area?
Generally, when we look at this, we look at, so on a daily operation, we collapse to the core, because the core of town, when we look at a heat map where most of our calls are, it's in the core of town. So our satellite stations are the ones that surround, are on the edge of our response area, are the ones that have lower call volumes, and they also collapse to the core. So if I were to, for example, if I was to close the downtown station, that would create a giant hole in the middle of the city, and response-wise, that just makes it untenable for us to be able to manage that. So we always collapse the core now when we get into busy times. We suck those outlying stations into the core, because that's what the likely next call is going to be. So unfortunately, it will probably be an outlying station. And like I said, I've got 3 or 4 that I'm looking at right now. None of them are a good option, but we're trying to be prepared if that's the eventuality that we have to make a reduction like this. And it will, the report I gave the other night about 5,315 people didn't receive the 5.5-minute response time last year. We closed 2 stations. That's another 1,000 people on top of that. So now you're close to 6,500 people a year without adding any call volume, and it's going up 4 to 6% this year. So it just makes the problem worse.
Thanks, Chief. Mr. Staley, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to the Councilmember Stapleton's question about rates. Well, it may impact residential rates. It would have a more substantial rate impact on commercial and industrial properties. So having a robust fire department is an economic development tool. by keeping our fire department well-staffed and well-positioned, it lowers the rates for commercial insurance, which are far greater than residential rates.
Thank you, Mr. Staley. Other questions? Thanks, Chief. Councilor Phillips.
I have a series of questions. Thank you, Mayor Hoy. I may not remember all of them, but I'll start to get through this. So I guess kind of starting with my questions. We at the beginning of the multiple presentations, we were looking at, what is the real world that we're looking at if we are unsuccessful in our endeavor to raise revenue. I've heard it's 19.4 million that we're short without finding a way to raise revenue, and that our general budget is 185 million. So just back of the napkin calculation, that's 10.5%. So we're reducing the general fund positions or spending by more than 10%. So in scenario one, it looks like using the priority-based budgeting, we try to spare the things that are on another presentation in the right top-hand grid. So we're trying to preserve police and fire to a certain extent, but I'm going to oversimplify. We're still reducing them by about $1 million. So I guess I want to understand, what does that look like? Even if we are willing to cut into community services by all the things listed here, and I'm not saying that I'm willing to do what scenario one is showing us, but in terms of best case scenario for police and fire, what does a $1 million reduction look like?
Chief Womack and Chief Niblock, you each want to give that a shot? Maybe we put those into some real world terms for us.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Trevor Womack, Chief of Police. You're correct, 10%. If you're looking at a $1 million hit for the police department, that equates to about 8 police officers about. So we would my prioritized budgeting is looking at our core services, right? So maintaining, patrol, emergency response. Anything outside of that is where you look first. And so we would look at things like our homeless service team officers, or the proactive work that we do that we've started to implement would have to be retracted. So that's where we would start first.
When you say the proactive work, you mean the community policing?
The community policing type work, the emergency call handlers, the folks removed from that emergency call response to do other type of work in our community. So including how deep you go. So there's really 3 general areas outside of that are bigger than the $1 million, but that's where we would look, right? So you have a couple homeless service teams officers attached to SOS. You have a community action unit downtown, which is the downtown bicycle officers, right? And then you have a strategic operations section that does things like high-level narcotics, trafficking, and interdiction to try to fight violent crime in our community. So that's where you would start until you got rid of all of that before you touched more of the core services.
And then I guess...
Could we hear from Chief Niblock first?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
Thank you. For us, we're set up a little different than the police department. So we have 11 stations. They're all staffed with 3 people a day. So if I close an engine company, it's not just $1 million. It's my smallest cut's about 2.5 million, which is a complete fire station, which is 9 FTEs and the 3 floater FTEs that go with it. So it's 12 people. I can't cut 3 because then I have one day that's not staffed. It doesn't work that way. And we don't operate with everybody that we have on duty is a value-added position. So cutting water rescue program, cutting the tech rescue program, cutting confined spaces, all those value-added programs, ARF, airport rescue firefighting, those are all firefighters that are on duty on a fire truck that do that as well as being on duty on a fire truck. So cutting those, there really is no fat or muscle left to cut. We're down to the bone, and I don't have a program that I could turn off and save exactly $1 million. So it's really closing a fire station for us, and that's pretty impactful.
Thanks, Chief. Counselor, your follow-ups?
I think the fire chief answered my follow-up, and my follow-up for police would just be, and what's the opposite? This is 1 million. I think you've touched on. We lose the homeless response, the SOS team, and we lose the downtown team and the proactive stuff. But what if we're at the other end of the spectrum, which is in scenario 2? What's that look like?
I'm very hesitant to talk about this because we have recruiting and hiring challenges right now and also retention challenges with our department. I know the fire chief feels the same way. So I'm just careful about how I talk about this. If we signal to staff these sort of cuts are coming, then it's going to be more challenging to retain the staff we have, much less recruit and fill our vacancies. So it's a careful topic to talk about, but a 5% cut would be the entire realm of all of our non-core response, and then anything beyond 5% is going to cut into our core services. So you're going to start cutting investigations, you're going to start cutting your patrol response, and so to get to a 10% cut, you're into core services.
Thank you. Thank you. You've asked that's all I have for the chiefs in terms of follow-up questions on this. So, the best case for protecting those first-line responders is still $1 million, which is looking like significant loss of current services. And, it sounds like it's difficult to do anything other than close one fire station. But even in that good scenario of this bad scenario one where we don't find a way to raise revenue, what is the real world of all this stuff in community services? Like the 14 million, I'm seeing the Center for 50 Plus closed, library hours cut significantly. Like, what does that look like? What is the reality of that?
I'm not sure exactly how to respond to that, other than when you walk over to the library, the door would be closed on days when you're used to it being open. Center 50 Plus, when you drive into the parking lot, you would see that it was dark and it would not be open. It's as simple as that. The facilities and services that you rely on would not be there and available. Parks would be maintained at 50% of their current maintenance level, for example. Neighborhoods and community services programs would not exist any longer. Those are substantial impacts to our community. There are a substantial number of people who rely on those facilities for their entertainment and for their well-being that would be negatively impacted by closing them. So none of this, as I started this conversation, there isn't a scenario where there are not significant impacts. And it's significant impacts to law enforcement and to police and to our community services. All of them are significant and are affecting people who live in our communities.
Thank you, Mr. Staley. I was kind of connecting the dots between what you were saying and what Mr. Horvick said earlier in terms of likely voters. And it seems like a lot of the folks that use those services that you just described are not the people who are in the likely voter category, with the exception of the Center 50 Plus folks. I think they are the likely voters. But I think a lot of our library patrons, maybe a lot of our park people are not in that. And so I'm just ruminating on that. Councilor Phillips.
Yeah, so I think I'm seeing that there's some likelihood of, like, for example, the climate action plan is just mothballed in scenario 1 or 2.
Correct. Climate action plan would be mothballed. Our DEI program would be discontinued. Some of the things that have pushed us out ahead, we would be pulling back from. Obviously, our homeless response being another one of those areas. I think the other thing that was referenced in both of the presentations that we heard tonight is the relationship between those services and our public safety functions. Even in regards to something like Center 50 Plus, there's a direct relationship between Center 50 Plus and our fire department in people's well-being. If they have a place to go, 5 days a week, and they're getting the attention that they need and deserve, depression goes down, loneliness goes down, calls to EMS go down. And the same would be said for our homeless response, where closing down those facilities, yes, we certainly can save dollars in the budget, but the reality is we're going to see that coming back to us in service delivery, both from law enforcement and public safety, police and fire.
So thank you for all those follow-up questions and kind of just restating like what it is in practical world that we're struggling with right now. The backdrop for this feels very serious. Like this is the most difficult budget committee I've had in my third time doing this for 2.5 years. This is the one where it all matters. more than it has in the past. I think that now is where I feel like I want to let my fellow colleagues know who will be voting on this. I'm deeply concerned about the prospect of taking it to voters this November. I feel like that time frame is concerning to me as a counselor who would then be responsible for trying to explain not one thing, like for no new taxes, you get $300 million of things you can see with your eyes that are built. But I'm funding positions and people. So it's just, I have to explain, the broken nature of property taxes in Oregon as someone who would potentially be the one responsible with no, pay to go out and try to sell this to the community. In that time frame, it just seems like a complicated, it's a big ask. And I know that what we got tonight was not polling data. It was the range of a focus group of what thoughts are out there. But it didn't seem like an easy lift to me. I guess I would like to ask staff, some of you have been through this before in your roles on staff. What are your views of what we've heard from our focus groups? Is this like an easy lift? Is this like a really hard lift? What is the prospect of getting this successful to get these needed revenues in if we give it to the voters in November?
I don't think any of us can answer that question with any more clarity than anybody else sitting in this room. You heard from Mr. Horvick tonight about the focus groups. We certainly can move this out. One of the things that we had contemplated is doing a survey, actually having Mr. Horvick go out and making those calls and making those connections to do a statistically valid survey. That's been included in our contract, and we're prepared to do that if council wants us to go in that direction.
What's the time frame?
I would ask John on that one.
It's ultimately a decision for the city, but we contemplated doing something by August? Sometime this summer, so everything has to be done by August.
Is that the soonest we would hear back, or?
So, what's the soonest something could be done?
Yeah.
We could begin a conversation. Just in generalities, we could begin a conversation tomorrow. Something could be in the field. Like if I'm talking just in general, someone says go, you can be in the field in about 2 weeks, and it takes about a week to get this data back, and have top lines, the overall results right away, and a full report 2 weeks after that. That's how fast it could move.
So about a month. 2 to 4 weeks.
To get top line numbers, I'd say 3 to 4 weeks.
Okay.
Things can move faster, but it's unusual that happens.
Fair.
Yeah.
Fair. Okay, so I'll try to get all my things. I want the $15, exemption. Those are my values. I heard from one of the presentations that on the top right, what is core functions and what is also mandated. I feel like we need another long-range planner. We only have one. One of our planning commissioners testified to the need for more long-range planners. I think that should be looked at and put in the priorities. My top priorities are maintaining our homeless response. So maintaining the SOS team, definitely funding the navigation center, and maintaining as close to 100% of funding for the current managed micro shelter sites, in addition to the $19.4 million deficits that we have. So those are my values. Those are things that I want. I also need a package that will survive, that won't just be recalled at the next election or will pass in some way, shape, or form. My preference is something like we enact it as council, and then we send it to the voters for review, in so many years, whether that's 5 or 7 or less or more, to be determined. But I want to guarantee that we have these services that I've heard at least 13 out of 18 of the community citizen budget members say that we need. Everybody there, I heard say we all know we need more staff. We all know that these are the critical services we want. So I feel like we've got a bit of a mandate from that Citizens Budget Committee, but it's up to us to get there. And I need to know where people stand on, their willingness to do, I forget what it's called, to consider referring it to the voters with a sunset. Yeah. So considering a sunset versus sending it to the voters in November versus another option that guarantees we get these revenues.
Councilor Gwynn.
So Josh, I know I'm regressing, so I apologize. So assuming we move forward with the utility fee and we impose a property tax or an payroll tax, thank you. Will that sustain us going forward, or are we going to be back to the voters? Because like when I was running for this office, I was telling everyone I know, we have to do this bond. It's a great thing for our city, which I think it is. What I don't want to see happen is we're going back in a couple of years saying, yeah, just kidding, we actually need more. So is that going to sustain us going forward with the services that we want to provide?
I think it's a nuanced question, and I really appreciate it. We talked about a deferred need of 308 positions. This doesn't get us 308 positions. It definitely helps. It's a much more sustainable source of revenue. It's collected all year round. It's not just once in November. It helps with general fund cash flow. It also grows with the economy, unlike the property tax revenue. So it'll better fund the positions that are increased and other positions. So it'll keep up. But it just depends whether or not additional services are added at some point, whether or not it'll be sufficient. So I can't say for sure if that there might not be some revenue measure in the future, but I will say it's a much better option than, say, a local option levy that goes up at 3%, and you're going to be back here in 5 years. So it's a much better, more sustainable option. I don't know, Keith, do you want to say anything?
I think you covered it, Josh. I'd be happy to respond to additional questions, though.
Josh, you should be a politician because I mean, I feel like that really, because you have forecasting out for at least 5 years. So to me, that's not an acceptable answer. I'm sorry.
I'll be happy to respond with some more certainty. It will depend on what happens in this room. We don't control the budget. We present the budget, and ultimately City Council will determine what's in the budget and what's not in the budget, whether this is sufficient revenue or not going forward. We have challenges, and this measure, this payroll tax, will address part of those challenges, but it doesn't solve the problem that we have with our roads and the lack of funding for road maintenance. That's another issue that we're going to have to address at some point in the future. It doesn't control our desire for more staffing and to continue to do great things. There's always going to be pressure on our budget. We're always going to be pushing forward. There's always going to be a need for more police, more fire, and better services in the community. This gets us a half step in the right direction rather than 2 steps backwards.
To more directly address it, if there's no new programs and no new staffing, yes, it works.
Councillor Hoy.
Oh, give me a second.
So, Josh, what I think I hear you saying between you and Mr. Staley is that all things being equal, that this eliminates the cliff. Now, we could create more cliffs through other choices, but this eliminates the current cliff. Is that accurate?
Yes, at least in the short term.
Okay. Councillor Hoy.
Got it back. I hear Manager Staley's voice in my head. Not often, but tonight. I hear him saying when he started in this position that he wants to build trust. And that meant a lot to me. And I know that time is going to march on, and we're going to be in these roles for a while. And I want to build trust with the voters and the people who live here. I want to be able to move forward and help them to feel like we truly are working for their best interest. And I think they're due the opportunity to speak on these issues, and it's our responsibility to educate. and to seal the deal. So that's just, I want to build trust.
Councillor Stapleton.
Thank you. I was going to ask you guys a question about risk, but I think I'm done asking questions about risk. I think what I would really like to hear is from my fellow councilors who were opposed to the motion that was put forward last week, what it's going to take for them to get to yes, or what they're willing to cut. Because, you talk about building trust. It's the 9 of us, and I'm trying to build trust here with you, and with you, and with you, and Gonzalez, with you, and I am trying. I'm pouring my heart and soul into this, and I know it's hard because we can't talk a lot outside of meetings, and it's really crappy to have these super hard conversations forever recorded into the history of mankind. But that's just the reality of where we're at, and I see all of this, and it's unacceptable to me. It's unacceptable to cut any of this. It's unacceptable to continue to put pressure on our police and fire the way that we have been doing. And I have a lot, if I'm honest, I have a lot of righteous anger. I do tonight. And I don't know if you can tell. I don't know what kind of energy I'm channeling right now. But if I were to put words on it, that's where I'm at. And so I need to know how we get to yes. And so I need just open, honest, direct conversation for me and the benefit of others who are here on how we get there. Because I can't song and dance anymore. Like I'm past I've passed my limit for song and dance. And I just need to know what kind of compromises we need to make and how we get to where we need to go in order to get this done.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Nishioka.
Thank you. So going back to Councillor Phillips' original question in asking, and also what Councillor Stapleton is asking, I want to say that I certainly appreciate the desire for voters to make choices. But unfortunately, I'm also very concerned that there isn't a deep understanding. I'm just still trying to understand it all. And trying to build trust with the voters comes back to we need to align to their needs, what it is they want, and we also need to help educate them. That's a big lift because there's so many ways to try to communicate information, and few seems to get to few people. So it's a big challenge to make sure that we communicate what it is we're trying to achieve, what it is we want to provide them, so that we can gain their trust and they then see it happen. And those are the challenges that we have with the voters, making sure that they understand. And I'm not convinced and I'm not even sure all of us would go out and educate our constituents about this. And then there they are saying, oh, I don't even think they're doing what they should be doing. Why am I going to give them more money? And back to the point with confidence of things that will be delivered, if we can't raise funds, then we're not going to be able to deliver the bond that we promised. And that concerns me a lot, because that's going to be another way to say, see, they didn't deliver what they were telling us they would deliver. I am very concerned about not having a good rating and being able to utilize that rating to get all our funds for the bond. So in answer to both of your questions, I am in favor of voting as a council on this because I think it's critical. We don't have enough time to educate the voters and to get their trust to the level we need, is my concern.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mayor. And I understand the timing issues if we take this to the public, but it's not impossible. For me, it's out of respect for our Salemites, fellow Salemites, and those who are politically invisible. As we heard today, we only pulled those that were visible. We're going to get this done. We're not going to let our city down. All of us are here because we care for our city. That's why we all became counselors. And then once you're a counselor, you realize how lucky we are to have all the staff. But I just want to mention that as chair of the finance committee, I asked staff early on what they can do, what we could do without small cuts wherever, before we go to the people, sort of as a token of good faith. And I didn't get an answer. I asked twice, same thing, no answer. The cliff, I asked earlier, was visible years ago. And we waited until the last minute. And now we're between a rock and a hard place. We shouldn't have been put in this position in the first place. So to me, in my opinion, even though it looks like we have a choice, we don't have a choice. And that's what I'm hearing today.
Thank you, Councilor. I guess just from my perspective, a little bit of a historic perspective, we were here 4 years ago doing the same conversation with whether to refer this to the voters, whether to enact it, because we were facing difficult times. I think, was that 4 years ago? It's all running together now. And we had the pandemic and things changed for a little while because we had some one-time revenue and that sort of thing. And frankly, we were just adopting budgets that the city manager recommended that maintained the status quo, just to sort of, as we were trying to figure out what the pandemic meant. But here we are. We're back to the same question that we had 4 years ago. And the options are still the same. So I guess I don't think that this is all of a sudden. For me, this isn't all of a sudden. This has been an issue we've been dealing with almost since I've been on, my entire 6 years on council. This has been a conversation. Now we're once again to a dire place. So it doesn't feel new to me. It feels like Groundhog's Day. When I first got on council, we had a closed fire station in West Salem. That was an awful thing, having a station that was closed, and getting it reopened was a huge lift. But it was really important to the residents in West Salem. I can't imagine what's going to happen with the conversation when we're talking about closing 2 fire stations. I don't want to be a part of that conversation. So, any other comments, questions? Mr. Staley, do you have anything? Are there we're getting down to the closeout time if we don't have folks. Yes, Mr. Staley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to be clear, what I'm understanding your ask for us is to develop a proposal to bring back to you for your consideration for adoption of an employee paid payroll tax that is consistent with the discussion that we've had this evening.
Yes. I think that the things that I've heard, and certainly some of the thoughts I've had, is it would need to include some level of equity where it has some sort of exemption for low wage.
Yeah.
I think, and with maybe options for us to discuss in more detail. I think that's what I've been hearing, at least things that people want to consider. Councilor Phillips.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm shooting myself in the foot by asking this, but I feel like I'm not hearing from enough of my colleagues to know where they're at to really have any sense of what's coming in June. While I feel like we got a mandate that we needed from the Budget Committee, we had to complete the Budget Committee process by our bylaws and rules. We got 13 out of 18 votes. 4 of those no votes were in this body. So this is a potentially very tight decision. This is not, I don't know that we're going to find a supermajority. I mean, I hope that somebody proposes something that I'm not seeing right now, but I can't tell where my colleagues are at. I mean, I'm sure they're still considering all the information, but if I can't tell where we're at now, I doubt I'm alone. And therefore, I feel like it would be a disservice not to start getting the information I'm polling. For me, I am this or that side of a no vote if we want to refer this to the voters in November, not because I don't trust voters. I trust them to elect us to do the right thing. And what I see as the right thing is raising revenues and maintaining services for homeless services that we have been found as a community to be a #1 deficient issue for 4 or 5 years in a row. So I need to know where we're at on the polling so I know that my colleagues and I can get to a shared set of objective reality and facts. Because I think there's an assumption that through a clever mailer or two, and we couldn't even afford 2 mailers for the bond, but for maybe, yeah. We have no money. There's no funding for this. Like, it's all just, donations. There's no entity that funds an effort to do the outreach. So, I mean, I'm just deeply concerned about the reality of sending this to voters in November. What I'm asking and begging my colleagues to tell me is, are they dead set on November? Are they open to a sunset? And if they're not going to do those, and this goes to November and it doesn't fit, like, then what are we cutting? Are we all accepting it's scenario 1 or scenario 2? Like this, I know there are no good options, and you may think I'm fear-mongering, but I'm deeply concerned what this looks like for our community. I mean, as an emergency room doctor, like the prospect that we would have 500 more people at our point in time count like this January than we would otherwise by having the services we have right now, I don't think people can comprehend that. Like, I mean, we can all imagine what downtown used to look like 4 or 5 years ago, but like, I don't think that's a sufficient comparison to this what could happen with this if we don't raise these revenues. So I'm looking for my colleagues to give me something like so that we can make more informed decisions, because we have a very tight timeline. We've all got to agree to a budget, which will likely include some operations fee by June 30th. I guess we have until August to make a decision if we refer to voters. But like every moment we delay, it kicks off like when we can actually start recouping these fees. And even if we can't find agreement and we get the 10.5% reduction to our general fund, that doesn't fix it. Like what I've heard the manager say is that every year from that year forward, we're going to have to continue to contract $4 to $5 million. Like I get that this is tough, but if people can just give me more like clear what they're looking to do, I think it would help all of us.
Thank you, Counselor. And I would just like to talk for a moment about, there's been some conversation about educating voters on this thing, and we just have to go out and talk to people. But I can tell you, having just lived through the bond campaign, that was grueling, and it took a big commitment, and it took a lot of money, and we weren't able to raise a ton of money. And that's the only way you can effectively communicate with the electorate is by doing mailers and getting out and talking to people. And it's a huge, huge lift. And I think that people who weren't involved in that can't fully appreciate how difficult that process was. And so. Councillor Hoy.
Just for clarification, is there truly no money for mailers?
So there's truly no money. The way that works is that the city can't pay for those mailers. So we have to go out and we have to do our own fundraising. For instance, I donated $2,000 out of my campaign account for mailers. A lot of people, we asked and they donated money. And that's how that works. There is no budget, there's no staff support. It's literally on the elected people in this room to go out and figure out how to make it happen, how to raise the money, how to get the word out. We had meetings off-site. We can't involve staff. It's, we partnered with the chamber on that one, and they were a huge help. That's how we got it out there. And Tom Hoffert and I went out on the speaking junket, and we were speaking to any group that would have us, and that's just basically how it worked. Yeah. Councillor Nordyke.
Thank you. Someone threw around the word supermajority, but you don't need a supermajority to pass a payroll tax by council, correct, City Attorney? Just a vote of 5, correct?
Correct. An ordinance takes 5 votes.
Thank you.
Councillor Stapleton.
Thank you. Just to be really honest, I appreciate you, Councillor Phillips. I think that I would join you in a no vote if it was just mandated to go to the voters in November. And again, for the same reasons that you stated, not because I do not trust the voters, not because I do not want to go to the voters, I've lived through the bond. I don't have any more personal money to give. I already give a ton of time. I'm willing to also give time, but that was a really, really hard task. And we had, like you mentioned, the help of the chamber, which was huge. I don't know if we would have their help on this. To me, that just like, it boggles my mind to try to think about that. I counted it 176 days from today. That is not okay for me. That's just, I can't do that. So I would have to be a no vote on that motion if that were to be made.
Thank you, Counselor. Any other comments, questions? Counselor Varney.
Thank you. As I've said many times, this is probably one of the most difficult decisions to be faced with in my life, because I take my responsibility as a counselor so seriously, because we are here to, take care of the community and take care of the city and make sure it operates. I mean, as a mom running a household, I think we relate to what that takes and the sacrifices, and sometimes we have to make those really tough decisions. For me, I feel that the voters elected us to represent them and to make these tough decisions under these particular circumstances when we don't have any money. We don't have any money. We don't have the funding we need to continue services. We don't have the time to implement it in pieces over the next couple of years or 3 years or 4 years. And then if there isn't any revenue, I hate to think of the risk and loss and impact to the community and to the staff and the city overall. I'm not really fond of taking risks that involve other people's lives if there's a way I can get around it. And it just seems that not taking action and moving forward with this ourselves is a risk I'm not willing to take for people. The consequences are just way too severe. And then if we do keep kicking the can down the road, like has happened in the past, just like deferred maintenance, in another 5 years, 8 years, we're not going to get the services back. They're going to be more expensive. We really need to take action now. And I like the idea of a sunset clause, as I said previously. I think that's really, really important. But right now, we need to get this safety net in place and get on firm footing before we can move forward to the next step. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. Thank you.
Anybody else? Counselor Phillips.
It's a redundant question, but I guess it's a question. Does staff need to hear more from us, or do they have enough guidance to interpret the polling question? I mean, is that coming no matter what?
I would appreciate more clarity on that. Is that information that we want at this point, or are we comfortable knowing what we know? It's not free to run the poll. And
so that's a great
John, you do
point.
great work.
What's the cost? The follow-up question that you made me think of is, what's the cost?
We've scoped out for the city. I don't have that number in front of me right now, but maybe in another document that somebody has.
Courtney's been working on that contract.
Does anybody who happens to have a birthday landing today have an answer?
Good evening, Mayor.
Evening. Oh, yes.
Council.
The answer is yes.
This is Courtney, and I'm in the Mayor and City Manager's office, and I was going to tell you that it's about $38,000 to run the poll, and we need 6 weeks to do it. That's what we've agreed to in order to field the poll, get it prepared, get it out, and then turn it into a report that you could review and consider. And so that means we actually need to be thinking about that really quickly and looking at an August date for your decision about referral would mean we'd need to get going in June.
And the reason we keep throwing around that August date is because that's the deadline to refer something to the ballot. Is that correct?
That is correct, and that is for our city attorney.
Thank you, Courtney, and happy birthday. So the deadline is actually August 18th to actually file our resolution with the ballot measure with the county elections office. You would have to adopt a resolution before that, adopting the ballot itself, and prior to that, you would need to adopt an ordinance. So we have something to actually refer to the voters. So, July is really the operative time to make all those actions and decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Atchison. Other questions? Councillor Nishioka.
Thank you, Mayor Hoy. So we're at the cliff, and we need to make a decision. we need to make a decision quickly. I was trying to think of creative ways to take opportunities to the voters, and what I have learned is that there's the possibility of having an advisory vote, which is something that we can send to the voters to get a feel. It's almost like a pulse of what they would want to do. And my question is probably going to be more for our city attorney, in the sense that if city council makes the decision with the sunset clause, could we, before that sunset came in, have an advisory vote to find out how the voters are feeling about the employee tax? Basically, we're taking a pulse of how is it working for them. I'm just curious, because then that would give us an indication if we would be able to continue it.
Dan Atchison, City Attorney, if I understand the question right, the hypothetical is council would pass a payroll tax with a sunset at 5 or 7 years or something like that. And before that period were to expire, you would also send out an advisory ballot measure, essentially asking voters their opinion on the payroll tax. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, we could do that.
What problem would that be solving?
Preparation for the next cliff.
Okay. Councillor Stapleton.
Thank you. I, for one, thank you, John. I really appreciate all your work, but I do not need you to go out and and do a survey. I don't know if that changes anything, and it's a lot of money and it's a lot of time that I don't feel that I have. I was hoping that we would move faster than that on this topic. So that's where I stand. If you were wanting direct feedback, I was trying to give you direct feedback.
Thank you, Councillor. I share your stance on that. I don't think that a poll gives us information that we don't currently have that would be helpful in this situation. And based on the amount of cost, I wouldn't be supportive of polling personally. Councillor Hoy.
Thank you. I'm just curious, I don't feel like we're in a Thelma and Louise kind of moment necessarily. I feel like, what if we took it to the voters in November, and if it didn't work out, council could still make a decision, if need be, to move forward on something like this, on an emergency basis or something like that. Let's see what the voters want.
So ask them their opinion and then do what we want?
Well, if that's what you feel you need to do.
Is that?
So the hypothetical is we go out to a vote, and if the payroll tax isn't approved, council would then go forward and adopt an ordinance.
I think that's our question.
Yes, we could do that.
Okay.
I'm not saying that's what I would want, but giving the voters time to understand what we're facing and give them the opportunity to speak. And further, when somebody's trying to raise money for a cause, I'm just I'm the kind of person that says, how can I help? I want to help. And when I hear about the city having trouble, when I first heard about this and became aware of it, I thought, well, how do I help? Of course, go ahead. I'll pay a tax. because I want to help. But I'm not the only one in the room. I'm not the only one in the city who's going to face that. And I know that if you don't ask me, but you put it upon me, I feel completely differently than I do if you ask me or tell me that you have need. Then I have the opportunity to help or serve, rather than the imposition and having it imposed on myself.
Councilor Stapleton?
Just a quick follow-up for you. So does that change if you were going to refer to voters at a sunset date? Does that change how you feel about that being told versus asked?
I'm sorry, to clarify, does that change which? A sunset or how I feel?
How you feel.
Does a sunset change how I feel?
Yes.
No. And I'll tell you why. Because I think about, I can have drastic thoughts, like if this was just my house, I would say, okay, what's the first to go? All right, probably the library is the first to go, because that's something we can read to each other, we can take care of this as a community, we can work together to help get people educated or to have time together in community. Do I want that? No, not necessarily, but I'm not going to create a situation where we don't have public safety. You know, I have to make priorities. And so when I think about what if the library closed, well, could it have a sunset where it wasn't indefinite, but it was for a time? And I don't mean to pick on the library. I could say any number of things, but what if those things had a sunset instead of a sunset option, instead of an indefinite dead date, you know? Does that make sense? Does that help you?
Kind of, thank you. A question for you, City Manager. Is there money that in our communications fund that if we were to be able to vote in a payroll tax with the sunset date, that we could then utilize the city's resources and money to help educate voters on what was going to happen and how we were using the funds? And I think this is even part of it, right? We have 6 months of education as part of, we have rulemaking and then we have education, but that's city funded, correct? Okay.
Yes. And the answer to your question is there money in the budget? No. The answer to that question is no. Could there be? The answer is yes. We could appropriate some additional fund balance. We would have to develop a scope of work and understand what that looks like. But yes, we could appropriate additional dollars to do the education to help voters understand, not voters, to help citizens, community members understand why we did what we did.
Okay, thank you. And I guess just, Councilor Hoy, what I'm hearing you say is that for you, it has, like your hard thing is that it has to go to the voters in November. And that if it failed and we had to cut, it would be anything but public safety. Am I hearing you correctly?
I don't know about anything, but public safety comes first.
Okay.
Good governance is our greatest responsibility, in my opinion, and public safety is that first.
Thank you.
Councilor Phillips.
Thank you. So this discussion has been helpful, and I appreciate Councilor Hoy for speaking your mind and being clear. I mean, I think I understand what you're saying. We may not agree, but I appreciate you voicing your thoughts. Thank you. I knew that I might be shooting myself in the foot by asking the question about polling. I think I've gotten more information by asking the question, and I'm not in support of getting polling. I mean, I think this is a question that the time frame, needing at least 6 weeks, having a deadline in August 18th, we've got to make decisions before then, in my opinion.
Thank you, Councilor. Other thoughts? Questions? Going once? All right, Councilor Gwynn, you gave me a no way look, and now you changed your mind.
I don't even want to So I get my only question is, if we're going to have a sunset clause on the payroll tax, why aren't we just going to do a public safety or ask about a public safety levy? That is my question.
So your question is
Because
if we're...
we have to go back to the voters in 5 years on that anyway, right?
Well, I think all of those things are still remain to be determined by this group. So, yeah, I think that's a fair question.
I would suggest that the answer to that is, why would we propose a payroll tax as opposed to a levy? It's that the payroll tax, one, generates more income, that it grows at or above the rate of inflation, that it diversifies our portfolio, and that when we came back to the public in 5 or 7 years from now, we wouldn't be asking for a new revenue then. We would be asking them, would you be in favor of continuing this? Which is a different question than, would you be in favor of adopting this new measure that we don't really know how it works? By then, we would understand how it works. We would understand what the services that it was able to deliver. And I think we would have a much better platform for the conversation about going forward in the future.
And I would add just one extra thing on there, and I think that a levy is subject to compression, and so therefore it's subject to other taxing districts in our area. They would impact how much revenue we actually receive, because it's all kind of mixed together and gets compressed down, and so that's the other part, other downside to a levy. Councillor Phillips.
And correct me if I'm wrong. Thank you, Mayor Hoy. I think it's a great question. My understanding is that if through council by fiat or with a sunset as built into it, it could be one vote as opposed to a vote every 5 years. Is that correct as well?
That is correct.
Okay.
No, I had a thought, and then I decided to maintain it as a thought and not something I voiced. I will say, though, for historical reference, so people who weren't here at the time understand, when we referred this to the voters last time, we did dedicate the money. We had a dedicated purpose where it was dedicated to public safety. And so that is another option. I think that as people, so we can understand all of the options available to us. We did have the payroll tax that we ultimately withdrew. It was going to be dedicated towards public safety services only. So that's something to keep in mind as an option as we move this conversation forward. If we decide to impose a payroll tax, we could. I mean, we have all the choices in the world about what we do with it. Councillor Gwynn.
I just wondered if that was defined. So was public safety defined in that, you know what I'm saying?
Our city attorney wants to weigh in on that, because I'm the person that made the motion, and so we'll let him talk.
I honestly don't recall how it was defined in our draft code, but I know Eugene has a similar provision, and it's law enforcement, some homelessness services, code enforcement, municipal court, part of the legal budget, and those sorts of things that are sort of the broader rubric of what you would think of as public safety.
And here's my response to that, is that no, it was not defined, but it doesn't mean that it couldn't be. Just like Dan was saying, we could define it, we could limit it, we could broaden it, we could do whatever, because we get to make those choices.
And I can confidently say that I would be much more likely to support that if there was a good definition of public safety. I would be much more likely to support that.
Thank you. And just in my mind, these are just my thoughts, but public safety involves police, fire, homeless services, code enforcement, those sorts of things. Those are the things that are public safety in my mind. Other thoughts? No pressure, but we have eclipsed the 9 o'clock hour. Councillor Hoy.
Happy birthday, Courtney.
Aww. What are the thoughts? Any questions, Comments? It's a rhetorical question. All right. I'm not seeing any. We are adjourned.